Chapter 512. Teleportation and Self-Destructing Chicks? Grimm had never imagined such a magical combination. One of the main reasons was that it was difficult to master spatial positioning. In the past years, it seemed that only Alice had this ability. However, she relied on her spatial talent and knew very little about the principles of space. However, when he arrived at the Goblin Plain, he did not expect that a group of seemingly stupid and noisy goblins would be so good at teleportation. There was a burst of flames in his eyes. Grimm immediately teleported away. There was obviously a magic battery hidden in the self-destructing chicks' bodies. The violent energy ripples from the explosion almost affected every inch of space within a 10-meter radius. If Grimm had stayed where he was, he would not have died. However, the violent magical energy could easily destroy the elemental energy in his body. In his previous life, this kind of attack would not consume his life force, but it would burn his mana. However, before he could regain his footing, a larger spatial hole appeared in the sky above the battlefield. Then, an overwhelming number of self-destructing chicks swarmed out. They seemed to have been sent here by the goblins to die. As soon as they saw Grimm and the others, they immediately activated their goblin fire arrows. Their bodies were propelled by flames as they flew towards them at high speed. How many self-destructing chicks were there? 100 or 1,000? Grimm, Sabrina, and Ender immediately used their unique skills to escape. Behind them, there was a continuous series of explosions. The violent magical energy chased after them, and they did not dare to stop for even a moment. The self-destructing chicks were not living beings, and Ender's poison aura had no effect on them. As for Sabrina, as a mechanic wizard, she was more focused on mid-range combat. However, facing a group of fearless goblin chicks that would self-destruct as soon as they caught them, Sabrina could only flee and use all her spells to save her life. Among the three of them, only Grimm seemed to be at ease. Every time he used his flame leap, he would turn around and use fire spells to kill the self-destructing chicks that were chasing after him. After 2 or 3 attempts, the hidden gnome boss was enraged and teleported a large batch of self-destructing chicks. Grimm's scalp went numb as he looked at the sea of chicks behind him. He could only jump to Sabrina and Ender's side and scurry away with them. The chase lasted for a quarter of an hour until Grimm and the others used up all the energy in the self-destructing chick. At this moment, the massive body of the airship appeared once more over the distant horizon. Go! Grimm turned around and glared at the floating ship. Since it wants to play like this, we'll go to its nest tonight and meet it, he said coldly. As soon as he finished speaking, flames soared into the sky and Grimm disappeared with the 2 girls. As night fell, the gnome continent that had been bustling for a day became silent once more. Under the illumination of the huge silver moon in the sky, the huge airship's body was like a super behemoth. Its metallic shell was wrapped in a layer of silver radiance as it slowly glided 1,000 meters above the ground. The enemies were still fleeing. From time to time, the location of the enemy would be reported back by the Magic Machine Squad in the distance. Every time, the enemy's direction would change. From this, it could be seen that the self-destructing chicks in the day were giving the enemies a headache. They no longer dared to stay in one place for too long. Although the floating ship looked cumbersome and slow in the eyes of an outsider. However, only by standing on the deck of the giant warship and looking down at the mountains, hills, rivers, and lakes that quickly passed by, could one truly experience the speed of the giant warship's movement. On the dark land, Roland was able to see many scattered lights. Gnome cities were clustered together, while gnome villages of various sizes were scattered like fireflies. Every light that was lit represented the continuation of the gnome civilization. Tigil perched on a small platform at the bow of the huge ship, silently looking down at everything below him. He allowed the chilly winds at high altitudes to penetrate his leather clothes and his similarly cold body. His 2 large ears, unique to gnomes, were blown to the back of his head, trembling slightly. However, just as he was about to let go of his thoughts, the sound of heavy leather boots rang out. "Lord Tigul, Commander Tort requests that you immediately attend a war conference." A gnome messenger wearing a thick windproof suit and goggles stood at attention and saluted while shouting loudly. There was no helping it. At such a high altitude, if he didn't shout loudly, it would be difficult to hear each other even if they were face to face. "Not interested," Tigul said coldly without turning his head. "Go back and tell Tort that if he doesn't want to kill everyone on the ship, he'd better put up an energy field tonight. Hold on for the whole night." The messenger could only helplessly do as he was told. Moments later, Tort, the captain of the floating ship, appeared where the messenger had been. "You're saying that those human magi will ambush the ship tonight? Where's the evidence?" "There's no evidence." Tort paused for a moment. "Then you have to give me a reason." "Intuition." After sighing for a long while, Tort finally left helplessly. An entire hour passed, and the energy field that could envelop the entire floating ship still did not appear. Finally, it was Tigul's turn to sigh inwardly. In fact, Tigul could understand Tort in certain aspects. Although he was the commander of the floating ship, he was completely controlled by Prince Gazru, who was hidden within the ship. Activating the energy field generator and putting up a complete energy field would put the floating ship in a safe position, but it would take up 40% of the energy output of the ship's spatial furnace. This way, the flying speed of the floating ship would be reduced by 70%, and it would only be able to hover slowly in the sky at 15 kilometers per hour. At this speed, wanting to catch up to the human magi who were constantly fleeing was simply a joke. Hence, when traces of the human magi constantly appeared in front of them, it was almost impossible for Tort, the commander of the floating ship, to stop the ship because of an illusory goblin's so-called intuition. Although he had long since expected this, when this cruel reality appeared in front of him, Tigul still felt waves of pain in his heart, and his vision was filled with mottled and blurry patches of color. Tigul took a few steps back, heavily crashing into a metal magic machine that stood proudly. God of War. This was the name that Tigul had privately given to his battle magic machine. Since he did not have any notable achievements, Tigul felt that he did not have the face to reveal this title that he had been fantasizing about for a long time. In the previous battle, the machinist companions he had led had perished at the hands of that evil Magus, and he was powerless to avenge them. Even the reason he could live until now was because of that evil Magus's benevolence and pity. These things piled up one by one, causing him to be further and further away from his dreams. When he thought of this, Tigul's heart felt as if it had been cut by a knife. Whenever he opened his mouth, he could smell the pungent smell of blood. "Old friend, tonight, let us use the blood of our enemies or our own blood to wash away the stain on our bodies." Gently stroking the cold and hard metal body of the tall goblin, Tigul gritted his teeth and entered the cabin, slowly closing the metal partition. As the magic energy battery was turned on, the dense patterns on the surface of the metal goblin's body began to flash with a dense purple light. But soon after, the light retracted back into the body. The metal goblin suddenly bent down, and like a living creature, it quietly disappeared into the darkness on both sides of the ship. Although Tort, the commander of the huge ship, did not believe in Tigul's intuition, out of the caution of a superior, he still arranged double the number of sentries and patrols on the upper deck of the ship. He even arranged a small team of 7 battle magic machines outside the only hatch that led to the inside of the ship. Midnight. The giant floating ship streaked across a high mountain peak, constantly adjusting its direction as it closely followed the 3 evil magi 70 miles away. What the goblins didn't expect, however, was that 2 black-robed silhouettes were looking up from the mountain peak beneath them, studying the giant airship that was flying over their heads in detail. From below, they could see the silver-white metal body of the floating ship, as well as the densely packed portholes and metal baffles on both sides of the ship. "Let's go up," It's time to teach these goblins a lesson. Although the voice of the tall figure on the left was deep, it carried with it a domineering aura that could not be refused. Judging from the voice, it was grim. The figure on the right threw off the black robe on her body, revealing a strange half-human half-machine body. It was Sabrina, who had just updated the armory. "We'll see you up there." Sabrina nodded, and 6 clusters of orange jets lit up at the same time under her feet, waist, and armpits. Her whole body shot up into the sky like a rocket. With the slight adjustment of the 6 jets, she was as agile as a fish in the air, and her speed was getting faster and faster. Grimm's body bent slightly, and with a burst of flames, he appeared 200 meters in the air with a flick of his finger. With the help of the floating boots on his feet, he strolled leisurely in the empty void like he was taking a stroll in a park. When the cooldown time of the flame leap was over, there was another earth-shattering explosion, and he appeared in the air not far from the floating ship. It seemed that Grimm had no intention of hiding it. He didn't try to conceal the loud noises caused by his flame leap. Instead, he just kept jumping. Chapter 5:13. Enemy Attack. As the ear-piercing siren rang in his ears, Grimm did not hesitate to reveal his strongest form. Elemental flames gushed out of his body and circled around him, turning him into a tall and mighty elemental fire elemental in an instant. Waves of scorching hot air spread in all directions, and the temperature within 20 meters of his body rose to a terrifying level of 3,000 to 4,000 degrees in just a few seconds. Even the alloy deck under his feet, flickering with a dark blue luster, could not withstand the terrifying heat, let alone ordinary creatures. The patterns on the surface of the metal began to blur and soften, and Grimm left a series of clear footprints wherever he walked. The sound of the goblin fire spears crackled like beans, exploding in all directions. However, with 2 lava shields and 5 fire shields revolving around Grimm, the gnome guards hiding in the dark could no longer attack as freely as before. Any attack that landed on the fire shield would trigger a corresponding flame backlash. The damage the goblin guards could deal to Grimm was negligible, but the flame backlash from the fire shield was too much for the goblin guards to handle. After a series of gunshots, the goblin guards ran out of their hiding places one after another, their bodies covered in flames. The elemental flames were stubborn and persistent. No matter how much they rolled on the ground, they could not be extinguished even if they stripped off their clothes and tried to extinguish them. As Grimm advanced, the goblin guards who had been set ablaze ran out, wailing in pain. After struggling for a while, they were finally burnt into a pile of charcoal in despair. These ordinary goblin guards might be strong and resolute among the goblins, but in front of a Tier 2 wizard who had come from another plane, they were as fragile as paper. They did not have any magic equipment to protect them, nor did they have any anti-magic equipment. They could not even withstand the 15 degrees flame recoil from the fire shield, let alone the 45 degrees flame barrier that enveloped Grimm within. At this moment, Grimm was like a terrifying demon that had crawled out of hell. Wherever he went, raging flames would rise to the sky. The weak goblins were like moths flying into a flame before they were reduced to ashes. The entire airship was more than 500 meters long, and Grimm was only at the front half. He was about 100 meters away from the middle hatch. The ordinary goblin guards could not stop him, but the 7 battle magic machines guarding the cabin door could. A few goblin mechanics were about to charge forward with their combat magic machines, but they were stopped by their captains. Their mission was to guard the hatch and prevent evil wizards from breaking in. Once he rushed up to fight with the enemy, new enemies would slip into the cabin, which would directly threaten the safety of Prince Gazruvi. With that in mind, the leader of the magic machine squad stopped his teammate. They lined up at the cabin door and formed a defensive formation, waiting for backup from the back. Ever since the enemy stepped onto the airship, the commander of the airship, Lord Tort, had already received the report. At this moment, the people in the cabin were nervously dispatching their combat magic machines. In another 3 to 5 minutes, a large number of combat magic machines would swarm out and drown the evil wizard with their terrifying numbers. Grim stopped when he reached the middle of the airship's deck. Instead, he glanced around, and a domineering smile appeared on his fiery face. Gas masks? Your reaction speed is pretty fast. On the charred corpses of the goblin guards, Grim saw that their faces were covered by a leather-like breathing mask. With his intelligence, he didn't need to think too much to guess the meaning of their existence. It seemed that Ender's toxic aura during the day had really frightened the goblins. Before all the goblins were equipped with gas masks, they only dared to follow behind the wizards and teleport self-destructing chick. They did not dare to send people to surround them again. Grim waved the destructive flame wizard staff in his hand, and a large meteor shower and flaming magic wall exploded with the cabin door as the center. It was impossible to stop such a large-scale spell. The 7 magic machine squad screamed in pain as they struggled to escape the area of the spell. Only then did they manage to extinguish the flames on their bodies. However, they did not expect that the terrifying fire demon did not take the opportunity to break into the cabin. Instead, it took a few steps back and shouted at the sky, "Stop that goblin for me!" The intensity of the fire demon's flames increased again, and the color of the flames changed from red to gold. The fire demon then gathered elemental flames in its hands and pressed them on the metal deck under its feet. At first, the surface of the metal deck was covered with a layer of flowing light, barely resisting the invasion of the high-temperature flames. However, as a strange rune power penetrated into the metal, the inside of the metal deck could no longer withstand the heat and exploded. After the first deck exploded, a second metal deck was revealed. This was an alchemy product with completely different alloy properties and metal strength. Unfortunately, like the first deck, they performed well in other attributes, and even Audiobook was clearly weaker in terms of magic resistance. Thus, the second deck was quickly corroded. And so, the third metal deck was revealed, seeing that the fire demon was frantically attacking the deck of the giant ship, as if it was going to break a hole in the ship's hull. The few magic machines guarding the cabin door exploded. Metal bullets rained down on Grim's lava shield like a storm, shattering it and splashing lava everywhere, but couldn't do anything to the human wizards who were heavily protected. 3 of them rushed out, while the other 4 stayed near the cabin door. But just as the 3 magic machines were halfway through their charge, 3 fire arrows with spiraling flame tails swooped down from the sky and hit them in the back. Following the appearance of the small magic energy storm, the 3 magic machines fell to the ground without any warning, like robots whose batteries had been removed and no longer moved. Magic energy asterisk. Among the 4 magic machines guarding the cabin, the goblin mechanics' mouths were wide open, and they simply couldn't believe their eyes. This was the latest magic energy weapon that had just been allocated to them by the higher-up. Why had they become accomplices of the enemy before they could use it? At this thought, the 4 magic machines immediately formed a circle and raised their pitch-black muzzles as they vigilantly watched their surroundings. Energy shields, gas masks, energy goggles, energy spectrum analyzers, all the auxiliary equipment was activated to protect them. Seeing that Grim was about to break through the deck, Tigul, who had been hiding in the dark all this time, finally couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, and his 3-meter-tall metal body shot out like a charging knight, a meter-long metal dagger in his hand stabbing at Grim's throat. In the air, a strange young girl giggled. 2 metal tentacles suddenly pierced through the empty air, the ends of which were as sharp as thorns. Shortly after, the mechanic Sabrina completely revealed herself. On her delicate body, 7 or 8 metal tentacles as thick as a thumb danced like the tentacles of an octopus, forming a metal line of defense that blocked Tigul's path. After exchanging a few blows, Sabrina couldn't help but cry out in pain. A metal goblin with the strength of a Grade 2 mechanic was not something a Grade 1 mechanic like her could defend against. In less than 3 moves, 2 of the metal tentacles outside her body had been chopped off. If she hadn't activated a goblin fire arrow at close range to scare Tigul away, her body would have suffered a certain amount of damage. At this time, Grim finally broke through 5 layers of the metal deck with his terrifying flaming hands, creating a bowl-sized hole that led to the interior of the ship. Grim didn't stupidly enter. Instead, he raised his head and took a deep breath. This breath was so deep that it formed a small natural storm in the air. When his flaming body expanded to a certain limit, Grim suddenly lowered his body and blew all the flame energy hidden in his body into the hole. Silently, a gust of hot wind filled with the smell of sulfuric flames suddenly blew inside the ship. Immediately after, a terrifying wave of flames engulfed every inch of the space inside the floating ship. The pure flame energy rapidly spread, and it was no longer a threat to the goblin mechanics hiding in the combat magic devices. However, other than the 300 to 400 goblin mechanics, there were also thousands of ordinary goblin engineers, alchemists, and other technicians, as well as many goblin warriors. Compared to the goblin mechanics, they lacked the protection of the combat magic devices. If they didn't hide in the sealed space in time before the terrifying wave of flames reached them, they would be devoured by the demonic flames. Grim's move was truly vicious and sinister. He actually avoided the hindrance of the combat magic devices and directly targeted the ordinary goblins who lacked the ability to defend themselves. And on the huge ship, there was no doubt that most of the goblin technicians were like this. The floating ship trembled slightly, and a deafening explosion came from the inside of the ship. It seemed like Grim's attack just now had triggered some equipment in the core area of the ship, making it difficult to control the entire ship. Damn it, damn it, damn it! Gazlervi, who was hiding in the secret room of the ship, angrily smashed the surveillance lens in his hand and cursed. Immediately after, Captain Tort's exasperated voice sounded from the control panel in front of him. Lord Gazlervi, this is bad. The space furnace that we urgently installed has been invaded by external energy, and it's out of control. Hearing his words, Gazlervi, who had always cherished his body, could not help but shiver. He calmed down and said in a deep voice, "Can the space furnace still be saved?" Tort's cry came from the speaker, "It can't be saved. A few great engineers are doing their best to save it. They said, the space furnace can only last for 3 minutes at most. It will explode." Hearing the word, explode, Gazlervi shivered again and said coldly, "Don't care about those idiots. Come to the secret room B512 immediately, we'll teleport away immediately. Remember, don't inform anyone. There are only 5 slots in the teleportation device. I'll wait for you for 2 minutes. If it's not even 2 minutes, I'll take it as you sacrificing your life for the country. Wait for me. I'll be there soon." Tort's shrill scream immediately came from the speaker, sounding like a pig being slaughtered. In the background, it was filled with panicked shouts and the sound of people running at high speed. Chapter 514. The floating warship was crashing. The huge warship was like a drunkard, swaying unsteadily. From time to time, dazzling flames and thousands of debris would be ejected from the hull of the warship. Among the debris were countless tiny figures that fell from the sky. On the metal deck that was tilted at a 60-degree angle, Sabrina stabbed 2 of her metal tentacles deep into the hull of the warship. Only then did she free her hands to hug Grim, who had lost all his energy. As for her remaining tentacles, they were continuously shooting magic rays to prevent the metal goblin from approaching. That move just now had completely exhausted the flame energy in Grim's body. Although he had the heart of flame to replenish his energy, the newly replenished flame energy was like a drop in the bucket compared to the bottomless energy deficit in his body. Only Grim dared to be so arrogant. If it was Sabrina or Ender who had used up all their energy, what awaited them would be an endless path of recovery. If it was in the sorcerer world, a grade 2 sorcerer would need 2 to 3 days to slowly recover after exhausting all his energy. In the goblin plane, where magic was low, this period of time could be as long as half a month. If they also considered the gnome's Ouroboros hunt, even a month's time wouldn't be enough to make up for this deficit. Only Grim could rely on the Heart of Flame to provide him with pure flame energy day and night. That was why he dared to squander his energy so recklessly. Otherwise, he wouldn't have dared to take such a huge risk and even lose his deterrent force. The ear-piercing sirens became louder and louder. One by one, the magical machines broke through the cabin and escaped from the warship in a panic. Grim could clearly see that every magical machine that escaped had strings of goblins hanging on them. The enemy's unusual escape had obviously alerted Grim. There was a spatial furnace hidden in the floating warship. If something happened to the spatial furnace, then it would be big trouble. Let's go, don't waste time here. I suspect that there's something wrong with the spatial furnace. Otherwise, the goblins would not be so panicked. Grim quickly reminded Sabrina. His voice wasn't soft, as though he didn't mind letting the metal gnome hear him. But it was a pity that the metal gnome didn't seem to hear it at all, and it continued to charge forward while sticking close to the slanted deck. Sabrina shouted. She pushed off the deck with her feet and flew away from the floating ship with Grim. While flying out, the small magic gun installed at the end of Sabrina's 7 metal tentacles fired dense magic rays like a spider web, blocking the path of the metal gnomes. The metal gnome was caught off guard and was hit by the magic energy rays. Dazzling sparks burst out from all parts of its metal body. Seizing the opportunity when the metal gnome was frozen and unable to move, Sabrina launched another 2-gnome rocket. The magical storm that exploded at close range instantly engulfed the entire body of the metal gnome. Now, no matter how strong Tygol was, it would be difficult for him to defy the heavens and reverse his fate. The metal gnome struggled for a while before falling from the sky without any resistance. Sabrina could clearly see that the metal gnome was a land magic machine without any flying equipment. If it were to fall from the sky, it would be enough to turn it into a meat patty at an altitude of 1,000 meters. Sabrina couldn't help but sneer at the thought that this guy who had been pestering her for so long was finally going to be out of luck. But just as she was flying away with Grim, a small white flower suddenly bloomed in the air below. The gnome parachute. Damn it, that bastard Tygol actually had this on him. Sabrina's heart was filled with anger. She lowered her body slightly, intending to dive down and find trouble with Tygol. Grim patted her back lightly and pointed at the giant airship that was falling like a top. The moment Sabrina thought of the spatial furnace, she immediately forgot all her hatred. She hugged Grim tightly, and the booster rockets behind her pushed out in unison as they quickly glided into the distance. When they rushed out for 10 miles, an earth-shattering boom suddenly came from behind them, and a huge, blinding fireball burst out from the horizon. The entire world suddenly turned from night to day. Endless light and heat were like golden spears, sweeping in all directions with whistling winds. Sabrina and Grim could already feel the sharp pain in their bodies even before the front of the hurricane approached them. This time, even without Grim's urging, Sabrina flew away with all her might. She dove down while flying, her mechanical eyes that were as bright as the morning stars constantly scanned the ground below, trying hard to find a suitable place to hide. There. Grim was obviously better than Sabrina in terms of elemental perception and detection. Soon, Grim pointed at a mountain not far away, indicating for her to fly there. There was no time or need to argue at this point. Sabrina swooped down without hesitation and landed behind the hill. As soon as they landed, a violent and ferocious shock wave whistled past the top of the mountain. All of the trees and plants on the mountain peak instantly collapsed and snapped, and were swept away by the subsequent shock waves into the distance. The ferocious hurricane swept away all protruding objects. Even the soil on the hill and the vines on the ground could not avoid being swept away. However, with a wave of sand and pebbles, all the soil and appendages on the small mountain were blown away, revealing the hard rocks under the soil. Looking at the sparkling light on the surface of the rocks, One could tell that the rocks in this small mountain were made of extremely high metal content. The whole small mountain was mixed together and went almost 100 meters underground. With such sturdiness, even if the explosion was 10 times stronger, it would not be able to destroy it. Using the remaining parts of the hill as cover, Grim and Sabrina were finally able to escape the explosion without any mishap. When the intensity of the explosion began to weaken, Grim climbed up the bony mountain and looked at the center of the explosion in the distance. He could not help but frown. Although only less than a quarter of an hour had passed, the fire energy from the Heart of Flame was enough to support Grim's normal activities. "Aren't we going to rendezvous with Ender?" Sabrina came to Grim's side and looked at the gradually dimming sun with him. "If I'm not wrong, that giant floating ship seemed to have been broken into two before the explosion, so there might be something left over there," Sabrina sighed silently. This was probably the biggest difference between her and the mysterious Grade 2 Magus in front of her. At every moment, all she thought about was how to stay safe. On the other hand, this Magus seemed to always place benefits above all else. After a moment of hesitation, Sabrina once again faced the scorching hot wind and flew against the wind with Grim in her arms. She flew towards the place that she was desperately trying to get away from. The ground below them had been razed to the ground. All the mountains and rivers had disappeared, and the appendages on the ground were nowhere to be seen. In many places, the floating soil had been blown away, revealing the hard rock formations and dry riverbeds underneath. As far as the eye could see, the world was half black and half white. The entire land was pitch black. Chaotic void energy and terrifying spatial turbulence could be sensed everywhere. Such a scene would usually only be seen at the edge of a ruined plain, but this was the core of the Goblin Plain. With Grim's reminder, Sabrina carefully adjusted the direction and strength of the booster rocket, avoiding the space turbulence one after another. As a creature of a plane, it was usually extremely difficult to pass through the barriers of the plane and step into the void. However, if one encountered a spatial turbulence, they only needed to close their eyes and jump in, and there was a possibility that they would be sucked into a different dimension. Of course, there was a higher possibility that they would be thrown into the boundless void, and their bodies would be corroded by the endless void energy into tiny particles that were scattered to every corner of the void world. It was a short journey of less than 10 miles, but it took Sabrina half an hour to fly back. The spatial furnace had exploded in the air. Hence, above the explosion, a small spatial vortex slowly moved in the sky. Around the spatial vortex, there were gorgeous bands of light that overflowed with brilliant colors. While these bands of light looked exceptionally beautiful from afar, in the eyes of knowledgeable magi, they were truly dangerous areas. This was because the laws of the plane and void energy intersected, and it was a terrifying place where one would die without a burial if they took a wrong step. In such an area, all the laws that were originally applicable to the interior of the plane became chaotic and disorderly. Grim tried to use his elemental vision to detect the danger, but when he opened his eyes, all he saw was a piercing red warning signal. If he had not closed his eyes in time and cut off his spiritual sense, the huge amount of data would have instantly overflowed the AI chip's meager data processing bandwidth. In such a terrifying area, even Grim, who had spiritual force far greater than Sabrina's, did not dare to recklessly explore the colorful bands of light. The two of them slowly landed half a mile away from the center of the explosion, looking at the colorful bands of light in the distance. Both of them felt like their heads were about to split open. They could clearly see that the remaining half of the giant floating ship was wrapped in countless colorful bands of light, floating in midair. Just like it, countless pieces of soil, rocks, broken ancient trees, rotten leaves, and the corpses of many goblins were also wrapped in the bands of light, floating in a mysterious and abstruse arc in the air as they were slowly swallowed by the spatial vortex. Grim's expression changed slightly. Chapter 5:15. Sabrina carefully traversed through the colorful ribbons. 7 or 8 nimble metal tentacles floated in front of her, silently inspecting the invisible ribbons of laws for her. These ribbons of laws were either regions of gravity disorder, regions of spacetime disorder, or regions of void storms. Regardless of which one it was an absolutely dangerous place for a mere Grade 1 magus. The metal tentacles in front of Sabrina became her protective talisman. Once she sensed a change in the laws of the plane in front of the tentacles, she would quickly retract them. Although there would still be some damage, it was much better than letting her main body fall into the vortex. Grim, on the other hand, followed closely behind Sabrina, not daring to deviate from her path at all. In front of them, thousands of random objects slid past like frames of a movie. There was a round wooden barrel filled with golden wine, a goblin gun that had been broken in two, a broken metal deck, a large clump of soil and green plants attached to it, as well as the corpse of a goblin with a purple face that was filled with fear. They were all gathered together, as if they were wrapped up by an invisible torrent, drifting slowly in the void as they were swallowed by the spatial vortex bit by bit. The two of them carefully avoided the more obvious ribbons of laws, and finally approached the huge half-broken ship. The huge ship was broken in half, and the entire cross-section was presented in front of the two of them. Even the twisted and broken metal deck could be seen clearly. Through the cross-section they could see the pitch-black tunnel inside, as well as the broken and damaged cabins. The things inside were still flowing out, adding more and more spoils of war to the colorful ribbons. "Let's go in." Grim glanced around. "We only have half an hour. Whether we get anything or not, we have to come out in time, or else we'll fall into the spatial vortex together." Sabrina nodded. The two of them told each other to take care, and then lowered their bodies slightly, diving into the colorful ribbons. There was no air or gravity in the colorful ribbons. Everything floated in an almost motionless state. Outside the band of light, Grim could see that the things inside were slowly drifting. However, once they entered, it was as if time had stopped as well, and they could no longer feel the flow of time. Of course, such a strange state was not a problem for the two wizards. Under the counterforce of the flame jet, Sabrina boarded the corridor in the middle of the broken ship. She used her metal tentacles to grab onto the left and right sides of the ship and disappeared into the darkness like an octopus. Grim stepped on the broken planks and floating corpses as he entered the belly of the ship. The two of them had a clear target. They were going to the remaining gnome cabins on the battleship. Sabrina was aiming at the captain's cabin and the warehouse, while Grim was aiming at the cabin where Gazlervi was hiding. Due to the loss of gravity, the giant ship was still slowly spinning, so after entering the belly of the ship, the road and cabin layout in front of him were already very different from usual. After becoming a Tier 2 sorcerer, breathing and eating were no longer necessary for survival. Most of the time, they had become a habit and a means to obtain energy from the outside world. Therefore, Grim tried to extend the flame barrier 2 meters away from his body, using it as a barrier to sense and protect himself. After this period of buffering, Grim's flame barrier had recovered by 15%. It might not be enough for a big fight, but it was more than enough to protect himself. This was the 5th floor below the deck of the ship. Although the ship was not big, it was still quite time-consuming to search. Grim wisely started from the 3rd floor, and it took him 15 minutes to search the upper 2 floors. When he floated past the cabins, he could not help but feel excited when he saw the layout of the 5th floor. There were many living things floating in the cabins here, and they were much more exquisite than the gnome decorations he had seen in the past. In particular, Grim found several explosion-proof doors with tight security measures. All of this seemed to indicate that the gnome living here was definitely a big shot who was used to enjoying his life. However, to Grim's surprise, these explosion-proof doors had already been opened, and it was done in a violent manner. As there was no air, sound could not travel, so Grim could not hear any strange sounds. However, he could still feel the slight tremble of the ship. There was someone inside. This strange thought sent chills down Grim's spine. However, as a Tier 2 wizard, such a scene was not enough to scare him. Grim slowly floated towards the destroyed iron door. Looking at the traces left on it, he seemed to have understood something. This was a messy and disorderly laboratory. A metal experiment table was floating in the room, along with various strange-looking metal tools. There were also many strange devices mixed among them that he could not identify. However, in front of the wall of the laboratory, a short and wretched figure was holding a giant chainsaw used by a logging robot, trying to cut a mysterious secret compartment. It was obvious that the secret compartment and the surrounding walls had been specially treated with alloys that were practically indestructible. Even when the chainsaw cut the compartment, sparks flew and debris flew everywhere, but the compartment did not budge. Based on the progress of this fellow, it would not be able to do anything to this mysterious compartment even if it was given another 10 hours. Tygol, we meet again. Grim looked at the familiar short figure and suddenly had a thought. He could not help but send a mental message. Tygol, who was focused on breaking the compartment, did not expect to meet a living person here. With a flick of his wrist, the giant chainsaw tilted to the side. Its triangular green head suddenly twisted around, and what came into view was a gas mask. So that's how it is. Originally, he was a Tier 1 gnome mechanic. Although Tygol's physique was similar to that of a Tier 1 wizard, he should not be able to survive in this strange, airless environment. Now that he saw the gas mask, he understood everything. However, why was he here? Grim was still puzzled. If he was a righteous gnome, he should be outside collecting the corpses of the dead gnomes. If he was a greedy gnome, the warehouse of the battleship would be the place he should be. However, he did not do any of that. Instead, he ran to this secret laboratory that clearly belonged to Prince Gazlurvi and tried to open the secret compartment. This was a little too inconceivable. Looking back at the tall Grim bathed in flames, Tygol's eyes flashed with a cold glint. However, when he swung his chainsaw at the enemy, he suddenly realized that he was not inside a combat magic device. Without the support of a combat magic device, with his identity as a Tier 1 gnome mechanic, he was as weak as a paper doll in front of the terrifying Grim. There was no need for any large-scale spells. A simple fireball was enough to turn him into a ball of flames and make him a part of this graveyard. I want to make a deal with you. As if he understood the situation he was in, Tygol immediately changed his attitude and shouted at Grim. Although his voice could not be transmitted, Grim could still understand him through his mental perception. I have no interest in making a deal with weaklings. Grim laughed coldly. Besides, I don't think you have anything useful to me. What about the coordinates of another plane? Tygol raised his hand, and in his left hand was a metallic ball that flashed with a strange light. This is the coordinates of a small plane. Are you not interested in it as well? At this moment, Grim's expression became extremely interesting. Unexpectedly. Never in his wildest dreams did he think that he would be able to obtain information about another world from an ordinary, low-level gnome in the gnome plane. This was even more unbelievable than a little white rabbit raping a big black bear. However, he immediately began to doubt the authenticity of this information. After all, with Tygol's identity and qualifications, it was impossible and should not be involved in high-level information like the coordinates of another plane. Unless, this was not something that belonged to him. Grim looked around and saw the messy living room at the end of the laboratory. He seemed to have understood something. Grim silently drifted a little closer to Kieran. Stop! Tygol's green eyes widened nervously. If you take another step forward, I will destroy this world's coordinates. After saying that, he took 2 steps back and moved the metallic ball closer to the chainsaw that was letting out a deafening whistle. From its appearance, it could be seen that the metallic ball was only a small and exquisite goblin creation. There was a strange energy within it, and it was not a solid ball. Damn it, It did not feel good to have an enemy in their hands. Grim spread out his hands and froze on the spot. He looked at Tygol with a smile. So what do you want? This secret compartment. Tygol tilted his head. I want the information in this compartment. Information? Grim hesitated. Don't worry, this information is useless to you. After hesitating for a moment, Tygol gritted his teeth and finally told the truth. There is evidence of Gazruvi colluding with the royal family here, as well as detailed information on his minions. I want these things. Oh. A playful smile appeared on Grim's face. That's right, I belong to the demi-royal family and am loyal to Her Highness Princess Vanessa. At the mention of his origin, Tygol's ugly green face revealed a proud expression. Chapter 5:16. Although he wanted to discuss the secrets of the goblins with this royal spy, the current situation did not allow for it. As the warship got closer and closer to the spatial vortex, the entire structure of the warship was affected by the gravitational field. The warship was pulled in different directions by thousands of gravitational waves. If it wasn't for the fact that the goblins made the warship extremely sturdy, it would have been torn apart. But even so, as the number of gravitational beams increased and the strength increased, the metal hull began to creak and groan, making one's teeth ache. The remaining half of the warship didn't have much time left. Get out of the way, we don't have much time left. Grim didn't have the time to negotiate with the other party. After a low growl, he bent down and rushed towards the hidden compartment. Tygol carefully dodged to the side and tightly protected the metal ball in his hand. Grim came to the wall where the hidden compartment was located and slammed his hand on it. Then, he silently sensed the size and shape of the compartment according to the rebound of the wall. Obviously, the item in the hidden compartment was very important to Gazruvi, and the process of opening the hidden compartment was extremely complicated. That was why he couldn't take it away in time, and could only leave the warship through the teleportation device. And this safe, that Gazruvi personally built, was obviously made with a new type of high-quality alloy. Not only was it abnormally sturdy, but it also had magic resistance properties that other alloys lacked. If Grim wanted to use his flames to corrode it, it would take a lot of time, and it would be difficult to control the strength. If the flames were to penetrate it, the information of the so-called royal traders and minions of the prince would be destroyed, and the previous transaction would be impossible. With this in mind, Grim no longer hesitated. The flames on his palms that were stuck to the wall burst forth and quickly spread across the entire wall. The terrifying flames quickly burned everything that was attached to the wall, and then outlined the hidden compartment and the surrounding area of 2 to 3 meters. The entire wall was 7 to 8 meters wide, and the hidden compartment and the metal base took up more than half of it. Under normal circumstances, it would be wishful thinking for an ordinary thief to pry open the hidden compartment. But in this kind of gravity-free environment, it was undoubtedly the easiest way to chisel away the surrounding weak parts and then take Migo along with the pedestal away. Tigul, who was watching coldly from the side, couldn't help but sigh inwardly. If he had thought of this method earlier, he wouldn't have spent so much time fighting against this special alloy, and he wouldn't have been stopped by Grim later. After the flame illuminated the outline, the flame energy in Grim's hands burst forth and struck the hidden compartment and pedestal over and over again. Finally, they were pulled out from the wooden cabin. This was a strange metal box that was 5 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 5 meters deep. If it wasn't for the fact that there was no gravity here, perhaps Tigul wouldn't have been able to transport it out even if he used a battle magic machine. With its size, it was more than enough to be used as a coffin for the gnomes. Go! Holding the metal coffin in his hand, Grim called out to Tigula and was the first to rush out. All the obstructing corridors and planks along the way would be destroyed by Grim's fireballs, leaving a large hole big enough for him to pass through. A human, a gnome, and a coffin flew out of the ship in a strange posture and pounced towards the edge of the colorful belt of light. As soon as the three of them left the light belt, the metal coffin crushed the flaming hand under the immense pressure of gravity. Then, it rolled all the way to the ground and crashed. "Why is this guy with you?" Although Sabrina had gone to the depths of the ship, she had obviously returned earlier than Grim. "It's a long story." Grim sighed and turned back to Tigul. "I've brought the item out, but before I trade it, I need to check if it's what you're talking about. If you dare to lie to me, don't even think about leaving this place alive." "Sabrina, I'll leave this to you." Tigul seemed to have expected this. He took a few steps back and let her do as she pleased. Grim's flames were obviously not suitable for such delicate work, so he tactfully handed the task to the mechanical girl and explained the whole story to her. Hearing that the reward for opening the metal coffin was a world waymark of a plane, even with Sabrina's calmness and steadiness, she was so excited that her heart itched. A spatial waymark of a plane. That was a spatial waymark of a plane. Even if they didn't covet the profits from the plane, they could easily get millions of magic crystals by auctioning this spatial waymark back to the Magus world. To a rank 1 wizard, this was a huge temptation that was hard to resist. Without a word, Sabrina rushed to the front of the metal coffin. 7 or 8 metal tentacles turned into drills and began to madly tear apart the metal. Although the metal coffin was made of an excellent alloy, it could not withstand the crazy destruction of a mechanical wizard. In just a quarter of an hour, a large hole was drilled in the surface of the secret compartment, and the items inside were taken out one by one. There were no gems or gold coins inside, only blueprints and a thick roster. Grim quickly flipped through them and saw a few names on one of the blueprints that shocked him. Sky Patrol Ship, Goblin Puppet Dragon, Goblin Mortar, Goblin Jumper Cable, Goblin Dragon Spear, Space Ripper, Thunder God Titan. Without a doubt, these were some of Gaz Ruvy's imagination and designs for more in-depth applications after he gained initial control over magic energy. Strictly speaking, the Sky Patrol Ship was a strengthened version of the giant floating ship. It was a flying magic warship specially designed for the characteristics of the void. After all, no matter how powerful the goblin plane was, the goblins were still very weak. Without a suitable flying magic warship, they might not even have the power to step out of the plane. The Goblin Puppet Dragon. From the design of the blueprints, it was a powerful magic machine specially used for land battles. It looked like a demonic hydra, but it was equipped with terrifying magic weapons such as the Goblin Mortar, Goblin Dragon Spear, and Goblin Giant Cannon. Attacking cities and seizing strongholds was undoubtedly its only strength. However, the two above barely allowed Grim to imagine the limits of their power. The last two, the Space Ripper and Thunder God Titan, were somewhat boring fantasies. According to Gaz Ruvy's idea, the Space Ripper was a special anti-space furnace. It could not absorb energy from the void. Instead, it could use the energy stored inside to tear apart the plane and create a terrifying spatial vortex. The spatial vortex created by the explosion of the spatial furnace was only 10 meters in diameter. However, its existence had already caused indescribable damage to the surrounding terrain and the environment within 1,000 kilometers. However, the Space Ripper in Gaz Ruvy's imagination could easily create a spatial vortex that was 1,000 meters wide. If such a huge spatial vortex really appeared in the plane, the foundation of the entire plane would probably be shaken. Therefore, if Gaz Ruvy's idea really succeeded, it would no longer be called the Space Ripper. It would be more appropriate to call it the Plane Ripper, and it would be more fitting. Just think about it. Sending a Death Warrior into the enemy's secondary plane and then detonating a Space Ripper. No, a Plane Ripper, the consequences would be too wonderful. As for that Thunder God Titan, in Gaz Ruvy's imagination, it was simply a terrifying magic machine with power as high as Grade 4. A tall and mighty humanoid body, an indestructible metal shell, endless magical energy, and a violent and ferocious lightning storm. Of course, the biggest obstacle for Gaz Ruvy to obtain all of this was the miniaturization and functionality of the spatial furnace. After all, if all magic machines wanted to continue fighting, they would need an inexhaustible amount of magical energy. Just relying on the simple and crude spatial furnace was definitely not enough. Therefore, the foundation of all large-scale magic machines was the magical furnace. As he flipped to the end and looked at the half-completed magical furnace blueprint, Grimm's eyes flickered with a blue light. The AI chip could only store all the information in the database in such a short period of time, and it did not have the time to evaluate and calculate the contents. However, Grimm could tell that Gaz Ruvi was indeed worthy of being the chief goblin engineer and inventor of the Great Goblin Empire. It was obvious that he was on the right path. If he was given another 100 or 200 years, perhaps all of these wild fantasies could become reality. However, with the average lifespan of the goblin race, did he have that much time to squander? Grimm could not help but wonder if Gaz Ruvi's recent activity had anything to do with the fact that he was nearing the end of his life. Human Magus, according to our agreement, I have to take all the information here with me. Seeing Grimm staring blankly at the blueprint, Tygol could not help but feel his heart rise to his throat, and he hurriedly reminded him. Although he hated these two magi to the bone, compared to his duty, it was more important for him to complete the mission that Her Highness had personally given him. "Oh, you're talking about the name list." Grimm snapped out of his daze and flipped through the name list beside the blueprint. Indeed, it was filled with the names of the goblins, as well as the trades that had taken place in different regions at different times. Grimm took note of the names, and found that there were quite a few mentions of the special surname of Demi. It seemed like this was the key information that the goblin royal family wanted the most. As for the other book, it was densely packed with the names of the members of a goblin financial group called the Venture Capital Company. Almost all of the people at the top of the list had titles such as Mayor, Commander, Army Commander, and so on. Grimm weighed the thickness of the name list in his hand, and could not help but guess that the names of all the members of the Venture Capital Company in the Goblin Plain were recorded here. Chapter 5:17. Against the powerful Grimm, Tigul did not have enough bargaining chips in his hands. Although the value of the world waymark in its hands far exceeded the list of traders, under the current circumstances, there was no room for it to bargain. Tigul was more concerned about how to complete this deal, and whether he could escape unscathed after the deal was done. Just as the few of them were muttering to themselves, the half of the giant airship floating in the belt of light finally came to an end. The spatial vortex was only 2 meters wide, while the giant airship wrapped in the belt of light was a behemoth that was 300 meters long. However, when the two came into contact, the hill-sized airship seemed to have been swallowed by an invisible beast, vanishing without a trace in the blink of an eye. The spatial vortex swallowed such a colossal object, but it was as if nothing had happened, remaining calm and peaceful. However, with the recovery of the plane, the area occupied by the fault of laws became smaller and smaller. The belt of light had already shrunk to within 5 kilometers of the spatial vortex. From the looks of it, the speed at which the spatial vortex was closing was getting faster and faster. "If you agree, then let's begin the deal now." Tigul, who did not want to delay for too long, could only lower his voice and request for a deal. In truth, at this time, Tygol wanted to take the metal sphere and leave. However, in front of 2 terrifying magi who were glaring at him like tigers watching their prey, he had no way of resisting after losing his combat machine. "You don't have to worry about the deal. We are magi, noble and proud magi, believers of knowledge and defenders of fair trade. As long as you don't lie to me, we will abide by our fair trade." A strange smile appeared on Grimm's face. "In order to convey our friendship to Princess Vanessa, I can let you bring back a blueprint for free. This is a powerful combat machine with grade 4 strength." "Grade 4? Magic machine?" Tigul almost screamed. In the current goblin world, the grade 2 magic machines he could control were already as rare as phoenix feathers and chelan horns. If he could really create a Grade 4 magic machine, would the goblin plane be afraid of anyone? Would this wizard, who was an intruder, be so kind? With endless questions and vigilance, Tigul put away the list of traitors, the list of minions, and the blueprints of the Thunder God Titan. He then carefully passed the metal orb to Grim. Grim calmly received the ball, and a prompt from the AI chip sounded in his mind. Discovered coordinates of an alternate plane world. Do you wish to import it into the database? Yes. A long string of strange lines and goblin words flowed into Grim's brain. It could be seen that the way the goblins stored the world waymarks was different from that of the Magus world. They incorporated some special methods of the mechanical civilization. The AI chip estimated that it would take him 10 hours 27 minutes 29 seconds to decipher the world waymark. Although he knew nothing about this plane, Grim had confirmed the authenticity and completeness of the world waymark based on the information he had. Alright, you can leave now. Grim looked at the fearful Tigul and chuckled. Remember to tell Princess Vanessa that I'm very interested in meeting with the Goblin royal family. Since that Gaz-Lu stopped working with us and lured us here, we naturally hope to see him decline. Tigul's face immediately turned pale. Ever since magic ability research had advanced by leaps and bounds, the Goblin royal family had become a conservative faction in the Great Goblin Empire. Gaz-Lu, who was at the forefront of magic ability research, had become the progressive representative of the Great Goblin Empire, becoming the father of magic in the eyes of all the goblins. Gaz-Lu's venture capital company had also successfully become a powerful force in the Great Goblin Empire that could contend with the Goblin royal family. In order to alleviate Gaz-Lu's overbearing aura, the Goblin royal family had no choice but to confer him the title of the first non-royal goblin prince. Many goblins even privately said that the royal family should marry Princess Vanessa, who was the most famous of the successors to the empire, to Gaz-Lu. This was to facilitate the marriage between the royal family and the strongest goblins. Gaz-Lu was already a 96-year-old goblin, and Princess Vanessa was only an 11-year-old girl. Such a small flaw was not a problem in the eyes of the fanatical goblins. These rumors were undoubtedly the greatest insult and challenge to the Goblin royal family. After all, according to the tradition of the successors to the royal family, Princess Vanessa was the most popular of the three successors. Any schemes or covetous intentions towards her would incite the wrath and resistance of the defenders of the royal family. Hence, the conflict between the Goblin royal family and the venture capital company led by Gaz-Lu in the Great Goblin Empire had already become very intense. If these unbridled invading magi were to participate in the internal struggles of the goblins, the split of the Great Goblin Empire would not be a small matter. The pale-faced Tigul nodded silently and left with the precious information. After the goblin had completely disappeared, Sabrina asked in confusion, "We're letting it take the blueprints of the Thunder God Titan away just like that? That's a terrifying magic machine with the strength of a basic grade 4. It's just blueprints." Sabrina might not understand, but Grim knew very well. If they want to build a Thunder God Titan, they won't be able to do it with just the metal resources in the Goblin Plane. Even if they send their slaves to dig out all the rare metal ores in the Goblin Plane, it might not be enough. Besides, I don't think they can solve the core component of the Thunder God Titan, the magic furnace. That's why the blueprints are just for show in their hands. Also, if they overestimate themselves and put all the resources in the plane into building the Thunder God Titan, we'll face less resistance. Am I right? Sabrina easily understood Grim's train of thought. The goblins aren't that stupid. They won't do something so desperate. That blueprint is more of a bait. I want to use it to lure out the royal family behind the Goblin Princess. So you're going to walk a tightrope between Gaz-Lu and the Goblin royal family? There's no other way. With our current military strength, we can't suppress the enemy by force. We need to use more flexible methods. If we have time, we might as well make contact with the goblins at the same time. With this battle as a footnote, I'm sure there won't be any idiots who still doubt our strength. This way, we'll have a chance to take advantage of the situation and balance the strength of the two groups. 5 days later, after sending off the Minister of State and the Minister of Military Affairs, Vanessa supported her forehead with her hand and leaned against the wide oak table in a daze. As a rare goblin beauty in the Anmare royal family, Vanessa's beauty and intelligence were among the best in the great Goblin Empire. Otherwise, Gazlowe would not have taken such a huge risk to encourage the subsidiary forces to force her into a marriage. The old emperor was old and bedridden all year round. He was no longer able to manage the huge empire. Vanessa's 2 younger brothers were still young, and it was difficult for them to take on the difficult task of managing the empire. Therefore, Princess Royal Vanessa, who was stuck in the middle, could only reluctantly exercise the authority on behalf of her father while waiting for her 2 younger brothers to grow up. According to the tradition of the Goblin royal family, the highest ruler of the great Goblin Empire could only be the male heir. Only when all the male heirs had died would Princess Royal Vanessa have the right to inherit the throne. Therefore, Prince Gazlowe's desire for Vanessa actually contained a huge and evil ambition. Once Vanessa marries Gazlervi, and Vanessa's 2 younger brothers die in an accident, Gazlervi would be able to share the ruling rights of the empire with Vanessa as the princess husband. Moreover, this method was completely in line with the goblins' tradition. It would not incite an intense backlash from the traditional goblins and the local tycoons. Because they realized this, the Goblin royal family's retaliation against Gazlowe, the outsider prince, became stricter. The open and covert struggle between the 2 parties became more and more intense, almost to the point where they would meet on the battlefield. The royal scout, Tickhole, had risked his life to send back the name list and name list, which gave Vanessa a huge headache. She had thought that with the name list in hand, she would naturally be able to get rid of the vermin of the royal family and their claws. However, she ended up with an even more disappointing result after summoning many officials and commanders. It had to be said that the consortium and financial group alliance that Gazlowe had personally managed was already so huge that it was difficult to get rid of it. If she were to forcefully get rid of it, the foundation of the great Goblin Empire's rule would be shaken. The continuous battles that would follow would speed up the collapse of the empire. This would only benefit the invading evil sorcerers. However, the news that she heard from a few hidden sources made Vanessa feel more and more uneasy. Those evil sorcerers from the terrifying sorcerer's world were actually brought into the Goblin Plain by Prince Gazlowe. Although she did not know what his initial motive was, no matter what, this action had already placed the entire Goblin Plain in a very dangerous situation. Once the world waymark of the Goblin Plain was leaked, it would attract a swarm of evil sorcerers. Then, the goblins would lose their authority over the plain, and their proud status as the son of the plain would be reduced to the invaders' prisoners or slaves. Chapter 518. It was precisely because she knew too much about the power of the warlocks that Vanessa could never forgive the detestable enemy who lured the warlocks into the Goblin Plain. If not for the fact that she did not have enough power to wipe out the opposing forces, she would have stabbed the detestable fellow in the heart with her own hands. It was too despicable. It actually dragged the entire Goblin Plain into danger for its own selfishness. Such a fellow should be hacked into pieces. As she cursed, Vanessa pushed open the wooden door and went to the small open-air platform outside the residence. This was a metal castle with a strong goblin style. Although the layout of the building was similar to that of the human castles, there was a huge difference in the building materials. Human castles were mostly made of earth, wood, and boulders, while the goblin castles were made of a large number of metal components, with the occasional addition of wood. Even the wooden walls had to be covered with a layer of sturdy metal plates to increase their sturdiness. So, from afar, this royal castle that belonged to the demi-royal family looked like a steel castle made of pure metal. It reflected the golden light unique to alloy materials everywhere. Due to the short stature of the goblin buildings were mainly short and sturdy. In terms of style, the goblin architects displayed their creative and divergent thinking, creating all sorts of strange goblin buildings. Just the roofs of the goblins' buildings were strange and varied, not to mention the others. There were round mushroom roofs, conical roofs, spiky roofs that looked like lightning rods, and strange roofs that had their own heads carved into them, so, looking from a high vantage point, there were no two buildings that looked exactly the same in the goblin castle. Due to the fact that they advocated frugality and economy, the paths between the goblin buildings were extremely narrow and crowded. Moreover, there were all sorts of wires, levers, and capstans between the buildings. There were metal trapdoors, suspension bridges, and small cars sliding on the tracks everywhere. Moreover, most of the buildings were still steam-powered, so their tall iron chimneys were constantly emitting black smoke. On the streets, goblins rode chocobos, golem beasts, and self-propelled robots, strutting through the streets with their heads held high. In the distance, gnome caravans had already arrived at the edge of the castle. The gnome in charge of the caravans was waving his whip, instructing the slaves to unload the goods from the Kodo's body. Above the castle, gnome helicopters flew across the sky with the ear-piercing roar of machines. A large gnome airship was slowly approaching the port at the edge of the castle. There was an endless stream of gnomes coming and going. Princess Vanessa looked at the people who lived and worked in peace under her rule. Her heart was filled with boundless pride, but at the same time, there was an indescribable fear and uneasiness. She loved her people, loved her own country, and loved the goblins' unique culture. But all of this had been changed by the sudden appearance of magic. Magic represented a cleaner and more efficient source of energy, and it could never be cut off. Hence, when they first came into contact with magic, none of the gnomes could reject this new energy source that represented the great future. But for some reason, the more magic energy they came into contact with, the easier it was for the gnomes' fragile and small hearts to be corrupted. And the leaders of the various consortiums and financial groups, led by Gazlurvi, all became arrogant and greedy. They even wanted to get their hands on the terrifying and evil power that did not belong to the gnomes. Vanessa could vaguely guess why Gazlurvi would collude with the sorcerer's world and lure the evil sorcerers into the gnome plane. After all, when a 96-year-old overage goblin grasped superpower, what it wanted to do the most was nothing more than to live a longer and more comfortable life. And this was something that the gnome civilization could never solve. Hence, for selfish and evil purposes, that bastard lured the even more evil and terrifying sorcerers into his home. And all of this was for the pointless struggle of a dying old gnome. The blueprints of the Thunder God Titan that Tygol had sent back had all the royal gnome engineers mesmerized and obsessed. The basic power of Level 4 could perfectly merge the gnome engineering machinery and alchemy technology into one. It would become the most powerful war machine that would witness the rise of the gnome empire. Once such a thing was successful, the engineers and alchemists involved would definitely go down in history. They would become sages that countless gnome descendants would worship. No gnome could resist such a huge temptation. Based on what Vanessa knew, after the blueprints were sent to the Royal Academy of Engineering, those white-haired gnome engineers had not slept for 3 days and 3 nights. They gathered all the gnome engineers, and then invited a group of old fellows from the alchemy workshop to assist them. They were in full swing researching every detail and core technology of the Thunder God Titan. In order to conduct experiments, they had applied for 17 major projects, 21 core materials and metals experiments, 175 technology verification tests, and 5 feasibility studies for the space furnace miniaturization technology. Based on their attitude, they would not be able to support such a huge project even if they emptied the royal treasury. Moreover, if they poured all the wealth and resources of the royal family into this illusory Thunder God Titan project, then the royal family's plan to build their own mana army would inevitably be delayed. Without a new mana army, how would the gnome royal family fight against Gaz Ruvy's private mercenary army? Without a new mana army, what could the gnome royal family do against the invasion of the evil sorcerers? If the ones who defeated the sorcerers were not the gnome royal family's army but Gaz Ruvy's private army, then in the hearts of the gnome royal family would lose their responsibility as a divine guardian. By then, what else could the gnome royal family do other than watch Gaz Ruvy win over the hearts of the people who originally belonged to them? The more she thought about it, the heavier the haze in Vanessa's heart became. Most of the time, the terrifying pressure on her frail shoulders far exceeded the combined pressure of all the other gnome princesses of her age. If not for the support of the royal family's bloodline, which prevented her from retreating or compromising, she would be like the other 11-year-old gnome princesses. She would be doing her favorite engineering experiments and driving the alchemy products that she created herself. She would not have to worry about the difficulties and problems that were yet to come. Unfortunately, she was Vanessa. She was the Princess Royal of the Gnome Empire. She was the most powerful gnome in the Andermai royal family. In such an environment, she could only throw away her clothes and put on her armor to do what she could for the survival of the gnome royal family. Just as Vanessa was holding on to the metal railing and looking at the people in her castle, a flustered gnome maidservant rushed in. "Oh no! Oh no! Your Highness, the Minister of State just reported that there was a sudden outbreak of a large-scale plague across the empire." The petite and beautiful Princess Vanessa's scepter fell to the ground. The plague had broken out. It was as though the grim reaper of the plague had just wandered through the gnome empire. From the south to the north, from the east to the west, a terrifying plague had broken out in the gnome empire. All the infected gnomes had a common characteristic. Their bodies were festering, and their green skin was covered with bleeding spots of various sizes. Once infected, no matter how strong a gnome was, it would collapse in an instant. From then on, it would become a pitiful fellow that could only scratch its own body until its skin broke and blood oozed out. Then it would spit out mouthfuls of blood. In the history of the gnome dimension's development, there had been large-scale epidemics before. But those epidemics usually had a clear source, and as long as the transportation was cut off, the scale of the epidemic would be greatly limited. But this plague was obviously different from the past. Not only was the scale of the outbreak huge, but its characteristics were so strange that the gnomes trembled in fear. That was, the fatality rate of this plague was surprisingly low. It was as though a certain demon god was playing a vicious joke on the gnomes. Although the number of gnomes infected by the plague increased exponentially, the number of deaths was not high. Among the infected goblins, apart from the frail individuals who couldn't withstand the plague bacteria's torture and died, most of the goblins were in excruciating pain and suffered all kinds of torture. However, they were still on the brink of death and didn't lose their last bit of vitality to the plague bacteria. This indirectly proved that the source of the plague came from those evil magi. The gnome doctors sent by the gnome royal family finally discovered that the source of the plague was the contamination of the gnome's water source. But it was obviously of no help. The large-scale outbreak of the plague spread rapidly among the gnomes. It spread from the cities to the villages, and from the villages to the settlements of various sizes. The weakening of the goblins immediately led to a backlash. The other races that had been oppressed by the goblins immediately started a wave of rebellion in various places. As the main fighting force of the gnome mechanics were infected by the plague, the scattered gnome towns lacked the protection of powerful magic machinery and fell into the hands of the other races. The gnome towns that had yet to fall had no choice but to start a large-scale massacre of the other races' slaves in order to protect themselves. This inevitably led to the other races' fierce resistance. In a short period of time, the gnome guards, militias, and local armies fought against the gnomes. Both sides suffered countless casualties. Chapter 519. The third batch of reinforcements arrived at the Goblin Plain as the surging spatial ripples slowly disappeared. This time, there were only two people, Alice and the Berserk Witch Sophia. Their arrival had obviously increased the strength of Grimm's faction. The number of powerful wizards had increased from 5 to 7. With Alice's unique fate divination, as long as the enemy did not purposely hide the information, she could obtain more or less clues through her daily divination. As long as she was around, no matter how big the enemy's movements were, it would be difficult to hide from Grimm's spies and spies. Because of Alice's importance, she undoubtedly held an extremely important position in Grimm's faction. Under normal circumstances, Grimm wouldn't let her take any risks, not to mention going to the battlefield. Therefore, Grimm quickly recalled Mary and Blitz and asked Mary to stay by Alice's side. Just like that, the 7 wizards who had come to the Goblin Plain gathered together again and began to discuss the future battle strategy against the Goblin Empire. Among the 7 wizards, Mary and Blitz were more inclined to contact Gazruvi. As long as he was greedy enough, Grimm's faction could definitely make a deal with him by exchanging benefits. As long as it was to its liking, it could betray the Goblin Plain once, so naturally, it could betray it twice. Sophia, on the other hand, was more inclined to contact the Goblin Princess Vanessa. After all, she represented the true ruler of the Goblin Plain. Although Grimm and the rest had caused chaos in the Goblin Plain, if she raised her arm and called for help, the goblins would still be much more influential than the traitor. Moreover, from the information he got from the side, he knew that Princess Vanessa had always been known for being kind and loving to her people. If they could use the infected goblins as a bargaining chip to bargain with her, it would be much better than contacting Gazruvi, who had ulterior motives. Mechanical Girl Sabrina and Poison Centipede Ender remained neutral. Although both sides had different opinions, the strategy they used was similar, which was to rope in one side and attack the other. The most important bargaining chip in their hands was the terrifying plague that had spread to 1/3 of the Goblin Empire's territory and infected almost 2.6 million goblins. As long as the voodoo doll was still in Grimm's hands, he could control the lives and deaths of these infected goblins. According to Grimm's understanding, the population of the entire Goblin Empire was only about 11 million, and 2.6 million goblins was equivalent to 1/4 of the total goblin population. If such a large number of goblins perished from the plague, the foundation of the Goblin Empire would be on the verge of collapse. After all, the development of the Goblin Empire was a little abnormal, focusing on alchemical machinery and magical machinery, and applying them to every corner of daily life. However, the highly developed mechanical civilization was unable to promote the advancement of the medical system. That was why the doctors cultivated by the Goblin Empire were only slightly stronger than the witch doctors of the barbarian tribes. They were unable to reach the level of the goblin engineers and alchemists. While Grimm and the others were planning their next move in the dark, shocking news came from the Goblin Empire. Something happened to that Princess Vanessa. This was a gnome town located 130 miles northeast of the royal castle. As a satellite town of the royal castle, the town only had a population of 300, but there were more than 2,000 technicians and craftsmen from outside. There were also 25 blacksmiths and forges that served as metallurgy facilities. Every day, large quantities of specialty metal ingots would be delivered to the town via gnome merchant teams or gnome airship. They would be smelted at high temperatures according to the requirements of the royal castle into metal components to support the forging needs of the royal engineers and alchemists. That was why the town was covered in black smoke all day long. Crimson molten iron flowed out of the furnaces like a stream, and was then distributed to different forges through countless pipes. The loud sounds of metal rolling, the sizzling sounds of molds rapidly cooling, and the ear-piercing sounds of the gnome lathes grinding metal components, the entire town was like a huge factory. Any outsider who came here for the first time would be annoyed by the sharp metal noises, and would want to cover their ears. But at that moment, in a large storage warehouse at the edge of the town, two groups of gnomes were in a fierce confrontation. The atmosphere was unusually tense. In the warehouse, there were more than 10 combat magic machines lined up on the right side. The front of their metal bodies were branded with the emblem of the gnome royal family, obviously belonging to the Royal Magic Guards. Beside them, there were close to 100 gnome warriors in the royal battle uniform. They held arcanite rifles in their hands and occupied most of the high vantage points in the warehouse. The black muzzles of the rifles were firmly aimed at the enemies opposite them. The Royal Magic Guards were also facing a group of gnomes. Although their clothes were a little messy, they were as elite and fierce as ever. On their chests there was an image of a gnome with a monocle. As outsiders, there were not many gnomes, only about 20 of them. But the 4 combat magic machines at the front had a brilliant magical light flowing on their metal shells. It was obvious that they were Grade 2 magic machines forged with high-grade alloys. In comparison, among the 13 magic machines of the Royal Magic Guards, there were only 2 Grade 2 magic machines. Such a huge difference in strength undoubtedly caused the mechanics of the Royal Magic Guards to have a serious expression on their faces. The haze in their hearts was hard to dispel. After this period of testing, there was no doubt that the strength of the Grade 2 magic machines was stronger than the Grade 1 magic machines. Under normal circumstances, a Grade 2 magic machine could only fight against 3 to 4 Grade 1 magic machines. But once the Grade 2 magic machines formed a small team, 2 Grade 2 magic machines could easily take out a double-digit number of Grade 1 magic machines. Therefore, in the situation on the battlefield, the Royal Magic Guards had the advantage in numbers. But if they were to really fight, the 4 Grade 2 magic machines on the opposite side could easily flatten the 2 magic machines and the remaining 11 Grade 1 magic machines. As for the Royal Goblin Guards, in this kind of battlefield, they could only play a supporting role and restrain the enemy. Facing a combat magic machine that was on a rampage, the combat strength they could unleash was not optimistic. At the back of the storage warehouse, an ordinary alchemy carriage stopped. A petite and graceful goblin girl with a blurry veil on her head alighted from it. Waiting respectfully in front of the carriage was Tygol, who was riding a Grade 2 spider magic machine. "Princess, are you sure you want to go in?" Tygol's voice sounded muffled when it came from the vent of the magic machine. "You have to know that if the negotiation fails, that bastard will definitely turn hostile and attack. Teacher Tygol, I insist on this." The goblin girl under the veil was Vanessa in disguise. At this moment, her face was filled with anxiety, worry, anger, and frustration. But when she walked through the back door of the warehouse with her chest puffed out, all her worries and anxiety were swept away. She turned back into the confident and energetic goblin princess. "Vanessa." Tigul sighed inwardly. He controlled his spider machine to slowly follow behind her. As if sensing Vanessa's arrival, a tall and fearsome magic machine appeared behind the goblin on the other side. Its appearance was similar to a fell reaver, but its metal shell was shockingly thick. It was obviously a defensive-type fell reaver. As for the special alloys and rare resources used to create this magic machine, it had reached a shocking level. Judging from the extravagant usage of the materials, it was more than enough to create 3 Grade 2 magic machines. "Vanessa, beautiful Princess Vanessa, since you have the honor to meet me, why don't you take off your veil and let me see your beautiful and enchanting face?" The hoarse voice of an old goblin came from the giant magic machine. "How dare you?" Tigul roared angrily. The spider-shaped magic machine moved its 8 metal legs and blocked in front of the giant magic machine. "Gaz Ruvi, although you are a prince, you can't be so rude in front of the princess." Hee. The old goblin in the giant magic machine could not help but laugh maniacally. "Tygol, you are just a toothless old dog in front of the royal family. Master hasn't even said anything, and you're already barking. Aren't you worried that you'll spoil your master's plans?" Tygol was enraged, and was about to attack the enemy without a care. At this moment, Princess Vanessa, who was wearing a veil, had already walked behind him. She gently lifted her hand to remove her veil and softly said, "Teacher Tygol, please bear with it for a while. Let me have a word with Gazruvi." Vanessa's sweet and alluring voice was like a refreshing spring flowing in a dry desert. It immediately cooled down the atmosphere of the fierce and dangerous confrontation. Even though he was unwilling, Tigul still suppressed his anger. The spider magic machinery moved to the side, revealing Vanessa behind him. "I'm already here. What about you?" Vanessa stared at the giant magic machine with a determined gaze. After seemingly hesitating for a moment, the rows of exhaust pipes on the back of the giant magic machine emitted hot air. The metal plates at the front of the magic machine opened up layer by layer. Only after 7 layers were opened did the figure of the old goblin Gaz-Ruvi appear. Compared to before, the old goblin Gaz-Ruvi seemed to have aged a little more. Its green skin was full of terrible age spots, and the dark purple spots almost covered its original green goblin skin color. His skin was wrinkled like the bark of a tree. At a glance, there was almost no luster on the surface of his skin. With the lifespan of an ordinary goblin of 60 to 80 years, Gaz-Ruvi, who was 96 years old, could be said to be the oldest among the goblins. Unlike Tygol, who had a longer lifespan after advancing, Gaz-Ruvi was still an ordinary goblin. Therefore, his life should have ended a decade or two ago. But with the authority and resources he had, this greatest engineer and inventor in the goblin dimension had obviously used some methods to extend his life. Chapter 520. Even if Gazlurvi was the most powerful and wealthy goblin in the goblin plane, his life could only be maintained with some medical equipment. Hence, after seeing the pitiful state of the old goblin, even Tigul, who hated him to the core, could not help but have a cold look in his eyes. His heart was filled with endless sorrow. If Gaz-Ruvi was willing to rein in his ambitions and use his intelligence and wisdom for the rise of the Goblin Empire, he would definitely become a goblin sage that was revered by all. Unfortunately, greed had clouded his intelligence, and his fear of death had caused him to lose the dignity of a goblin. The current Goblin Empire was blessed by this damned old goblin, and there were already signs of division that worried all the goblins. If this situation were to continue, the ruling authority of the goblin royal family would be taken away by the local financial groups sooner or later. After a simple appearance, the metal plates of the giant magical machine closed up, and the old Gazlurvi was once again protected by a thick alloy shell. "Your Highness, you sent someone to secretly summon me here. There must be an extremely important matter." "I don't know." Gazlurvi paused at this point. "Gazlurvi, we are noble goblins who hold supreme power. There's no need to pretend here. Don't you know the reason why I summoned you here?" An angry expression appeared on Vanessa's delicate, light green face. "The invading evil sorcerers have released such a terrifying plague in our kingdom. Are we just going to sit back and let them do whatever they want?" "Then, Your Highness, what do you mean? I hope that we can work together and eliminate these evil magi first. As for the internal conflict between us, we can resolve it through other methods after the external threat has been dealt with." Gazlurvi was silent. The atmosphere in the room became tense. Goblins do not fight goblins. Such a simple thought actually existed in the minds of all the goblins. However, due to the difference in political ideologies between the leaders of both sides, they had no choice but to stand on opposite sides and hate each other. If Gazlurvi really accepted Princess Vanessa's suggestion, it would be the best thing for the Goblin Empire to mend the cracks in itself. Because this matter was too important, all the goblins present could not help but hold their breath, silently waiting for the old goblin Gaz-Ruvi's answer. After a long silence, Gazlurvi finally spoke. "Her Royal Highness's proposal is actually a plan that I've thought of a long time ago. However, due to the distrust between both sides, it's difficult to fully carry out this kind of cooperation. So, in order to truly fuse their powers, I have another suggestion. Propose what? Princess Vanessa's jade-green eyes lit up with a glint of surprise when she saw that her idea had gotten a response from the other party. I suggest, Gaz Lurvy's aged voice came through the microphone, his tone getting lower and lower. When he made a proposal, his voice was so low that it was hard to hear. Just as Princess Vanessa was leaning forward and trying to decipher the other party's words, the floor of the warehouse suddenly shook violently. The next moment, the ground under the feet of the Royal Magic Guards suddenly split open, and a spiral-shaped metal cone spun at high speed. A Grade 1 magical machine could not dodge in time, and was stuck in the middle of its body by the high-speed spinning cone. Amidst the deafening sound of metal clanking, a goblin drilling machine emerged from the ground and revealed the huge metal at the back of the cone. The unlucky magical machine was pierced by the squeaking drill, and its entire body was drilled through. As purplish-black blood flowed down the drill, the metal cylinder suddenly opened, and a shocking number of goblin suicide squad rushed out. They were wearing power-assisted exoskeleton armor, and had a Biznik 247 by 128 precision scope on their head. They were holding fire core sniper rifles in their hands, and there were foldable metal shields on their elbows. There were high-temperature flamethrowers on their shoulders, and there were magical bombs hanging on their waists. Although they did not have combat magical machines, their terrifying equipment allowed them to disrupt the formation of the Royal Guards. As soon as they appeared, they did not even wait for the Royal Guards to react before magical bombs were thrown at them. Amidst the terrifying rumbling sounds, streaks of fire, dragon-like flames, and high-powered metal projectiles instantly flooded the battlefield. Although the Royal Guards were caught off guard, and 20 to 30 of them were injured in the first instant, their strict training and superior equipment allowed them to withstand the attack of the Goblin Suicide Squad. Both parties engaged in an intense battle in a corner of the warehouse. At this moment, the thick metal roof of the warehouse was suddenly blasted open, and several combat magic machines with metal chains hanging from them suddenly dropped down from above. Through the hole in the roof, they could see the goblin airships above the warehouse. The sudden change infuriated Goblin Princess Vanessa. Before she could ask anything, the giant magical machine that had been standing still suddenly lowered its body and grabbed her with its fan-like alloy hand. However, when the alloy hand was only half a meter away from Vanessa, the spider-shaped magical machine that Tigul was controlling had already collided with the alloy hand from the side. At the same time, the spider magical machine extended one of its limbs and used the most gentle force to push the goblin princess away. Dong! A deafening clang of metal resounded. The alloy hand missed its target, and grabbed a goblin maidservant beside Vanessa instead. Seeing that the ambush had failed, the old goblin Gaz raspy grunt came from the giant magical machine. He clenched his hand and crushed the goblin maidservant alive. Agatha! Princess Vanessa screamed in agony, and reached out for the blood splattering in the air. She did not even have the time to cry for the maidservant who had followed her for many years. Vanessa was surrounded by the goblin royal guards, and they quickly retreated to the back door. The royal combat magical machines could not be bothered to help the royal guards clear up the suicide squad. They swarmed to the periphery of the princess's team, and fired at every enemy that pounced at them. Warriors against warriors, magic machines against magic machines, the tall combat magical machines fired fiercely as they rapidly closed in on each other. When both parties were within a certain distance, they would give up on the barrage attack, and use the large metal chainsaws or guns to attack each other's weak spots. Energy shields could resist the burning of flames, while metal shields or thick arms could block the enemy's close-range weapons. When the two gigantic metal magical machines came together, there was a series of metallic clangs and ear-piercing sounds of metal rubbing against each other. Metal shards flew everywhere and sparks flew. The life and death battle between the two metal magical machines was also a battle of fists and blades. It was no less dangerous than a physical fight. In just a few seconds, 5 magical machines had fallen on the battlefield. 3 belonged to the royal family, and 2 belonged to the old goblin Gaz. As for the goblin warriors who were supporting the royal family, more than 100 of them had perished. With the princess's retreating team as the center, battles of all sizes erupted one after another, and the number of royal guards surrounding the princess was also rapidly decreasing. However, this was still the royal family's territory, so the number of royal guards hidden around the warehouse was no less than the goblin army that launched the surprise attack. Almost as soon as the battle broke out in the warehouse, the entire gnome town was filled with the sounds of gunfire and battle magic machines crashing into each other. In order to cover the princess' retreat, Tigul had no choice but to use his level 2 spider magic machine to launch a tidal wave of attacks against the level 2 giant magic machine. Although Gazrul was a great engineer and inventor, he was not good at controlling magical machines. Therefore, the giant magical machine seemed very clumsy and slow under his control, and it was almost unable to display its full combat power. However, in order to protect himself, Gazrul had invested a lot of resources and effort into this giant magical machine, which made the goblin army vomit blood. It did not disappoint, and its sturdiness made the goblin army's hair stand on end. At least, Tigul, who was fighting against it, had the urge to vomit blood. For most combat magical machines, they needed to find a balance between the sturdiness of the armor and the activity of the mechanical machine spirit. They could not let the heavy armor drag down the agility too much, nor could they sacrifice the safety of the goblin mechanic for the sake of agility. However, the giant magical machine in front of them was obviously an extreme counterexample. It had completely allocated the power of the giant magical machine to the layers of alloy armor, and did not consider its own mobility and agility in combat at all. Standing there, it was like a rhinoceros covered in more than 10 layers of metal armor. It could not move at all, but it was so sturdy that no one wanted to fight against it. Whether it was the powerful close-range explosive fire, the violent eruption of high-radiation flames, or the piercing of the sharp limbs, none of them could move the layers of alloy armor. Even if you spent a lot of effort to break through one layer, there was still another layer below. Even if you worked hard to break through 2 layers, there was still a 3rd layer below. This was simply a huge torture, deeply troubling Tigul, who had always prided himself on his strength. Even with his strength, it was really difficult to use the weapons on the spider magical machine to harm the old goblin inside the giant magical machine. As for the old goblin who was hiding behind the giant magical equipment, he was like a super boss, clumsily blocking Tigul's attacks while pulling out all sorts of strange magical weapons from hidden parts of his metal body to counterattack. Chapter 521. This was a classic civil war among the gnomes. Due to the limitations of the battlefield, the scale of the civil war was not huge, but the process of the battle was extremely brutal and bloody. The leaders of both sides were trapped in a metal ore storage warehouse that was less than 700 square meters, and the soldiers on the periphery were still pouring in. The leaders of both sides were trapped in a metal ore storage warehouse with a surface area of less than 700 square meters, and the soldiers on the periphery were still pouring in. The royal guards protecting the princess were in an awkward position. In front of them were 20 to 30 combat magic machines fighting to the death, and behind them were the enemy's suicide squad. They were stuck in the middle, unable to advance or retreat. At that moment they did not know where to run to. The gnome town was the royal family's territory, after all. The number of gnome troops gathered here was undoubtedly far greater than Gazruvi's private army. But unfortunately, it was because of the obvious advantage in numbers that Princess Vanessa and the military minister let their guard down. They really couldn't imagine that this arrogant Gazruvi would dare to do such a barbaric thing like kidnapping people in their territory. When the evil sorcerer was stirring up trouble in the gnome plain, the old gnome not only ignored the Princess Olive Branch, but also acted as though he was willing to instigate a civil war among the gnomes to snatch the princess away. This brainless action was clearly beyond the scope of a normal gnome's thinking. Hence, Princess Vanessa staggered as she retreated with the guards, and muttered in pain, "Mad. Mad. He must be mad." Even someone as smart as she could not understand the madness of a dying old gnome. Especially when this dying old gnome still saw himself as the future and hope of the gnome empire. When he was at the end of his life, how strong was his desire to live. If the gnome empire could not rise under his leadership, then he would rather all the gnomes perish with him. The battle was still going on intensely, as the main attacker, the old gnome's private army, might not be as large as the local garrison, but they were far superior to the royal guards in terms of equipment quality and combat ability. Before they came, the old gnome's private army seemed to have already decided on their target. Hence, their target was clear, and the battle layout was reasonable. Almost as soon as the battle started, they used both the ground and the air to control all the strategic locations around the storage warehouse. Although the royal guards in the warehouse were still resisting with all their might, they were clearly at a disadvantage. Under the enemy's encirclement, the number of royal guards decreased sharply. Very soon, the original 100 soldiers dropped to a miserable state of less than 10. As for the troops stationed by the royal family, due to the suddenness of the incident, they were blocked by a team of magic machines and could not get close. So, at the same time, both inside and outside the warehouse, there were combat magic machines and goblin warriors fighting together. Magical weapons, alchemy weapons, and other weapons could be seen everywhere on the battlefield. The intelligent goblins had modified them into terrifying killing weapons. At every moment, there would be dozens or even hundreds of gnomes falling to the ground in pain, becoming the victims of this chaotic slaughter. When the last gnome guard was shot full of holes, only Princess Vanessa and Tichel's magic machine were left in the field. On the other hand, they had to face double digits of battle magical machines and triple digits of goblin mercenaries. Among them, there were as many as 3 Grade 1 goblin mechanics that were on the same level as Tigul, and they were all using Grade 2 magical machines. After going through a series of bloody battles, Tichel's spider magic machine was already riddled with wounds, and its combat capability was greatly reduced. Only 5 of the 8 legs that were evenly distributed on both sides of its body were left, and more than half of the rapid-fire arrays around the spider's body had been destroyed. Even the high-radiation flamethrower on the back of the spider's metal body was nowhere to be seen, leaving only half of its metal base. If this was all they had to face, then the battlefield before them would not be able to trap the ruthless Tichel. However, Vanessa, who had lost the protection of her guards, was hiding behind him. This also caused Tichel to lose the ability to dodge the attacks of the enemy's magic machines. Most of the time, he even had to use his metal body to block the stray bullets and accidental damage for Vanessa. Hence, when he faced the encirclement of enemies that were slowly closing in on him, even the invincible Tichel felt a sense of dejection, as if he had the heart to kill the enemy but was powerless to do so. Kacha, when the countless black gun muzzles forced them to the center, Tichel threw away the torn Grade 1 magic machine in his hand, and gave up resisting with a dejected expression. At such a close distance, there were many enemies. He could no longer protect the princess. If he continued to attack, any stray bullet could cause fatal harm to Princess Vanessa. By then, no matter how many enemies he killed, he would not be able to save the princess' life. Losing the princess would be an unbearable nightmare for the Goblin Empire. Hence, the princess had to live. When Princess Vanessa fell into the old goblin's hands, the battle on the periphery gradually stopped. All the royal goblin commanders were at a loss. They did not know if they should continue attacking or negotiate with the enemy. Due to the fear of harming the innocent, the royal goblin army did not dare to attack recklessly even when the old goblin brought Princess Vanessa onto the goblin airship. They could only watch as they left the battlefield. The battle that had taken place near the royal castle had started and ended abruptly. If not for Mary's informant among the goblins, the sorcerers would not have known that the leaders of the two major factions in the Goblin Plain had met in secret. As the goblins kept a tight lid on the information, Grim and the rest only received the specific information 3 days after the incident. By then, the old goblin Gaz Ruvi had already returned to Steel City with his spoils of war. That was originally the capital of the Goblin Empire, the territory of the Goblin royal family. However, with the rise of the Goblins' radical faction, Steel City gradually became a gathering place for all the financial groups and tycoons. Especially in recent decades, with the advancement of magic energy research, large amounts of wealth and resources quickly gathered in the hands of a venture capital company headed by Gaz Ruvi. Hence, these radical goblins recruited people everywhere and mass-produced magical weapons. Soon, they formed a goblin organization with armed merchants as the main body. The leaders of these goblin merchants were businessmen, tycoons, and a group of powerful bandits. Under their pressure, the conservative and traditionalist goblins could only quietly withdraw from the center of power of the Goblin Empire, Steel City. Now, Steel City had become the base camp of the crazy old goblin Gaz Ruvi. Grim's information about the battle between the goblins' traditionalist faction and the radical faction was very vague and lacking in logic. So much so that Grim still couldn't figure out what the crazy old goblin was thinking. Wealth and resources? To a native of a small plain, Gaz Ruvi was only one step away from becoming the number one person in the plain. Logically speaking, he should not use such a radical method to provoke the anger of the traditionalist faction. The only thing that could explain his actions was a rumor circulating in the Goblin Plain. According to the rumor, the smartest goblin in the world was only thinking about eternal life. And all the crazy things he was doing could be related to a plan called Eternal Life. Just as Grim and the others were gathering in a secluded mountain range, a mysterious guest suddenly came to their camp. Tigul. Night fell. Under the beautiful starry sky was a quiet and serene forest. Tigul broke into the wizard camp alone and handed Grim a draft cooperation agreement with the Goblin Royal Seal in front of a bright bonfire. As the leader of the wizards, Grim was naturally the first one to read this strange agreement. After reading the agreement with a strange expression, Grim shoved the parchment into Alice's hands. Then, he silently observed the exhausted and haggard goblin war god across the bonfire. Alice quickly finished reading it and passed it to Mary. Then, in the shortest time possible, all the wizards around the bonfire read the agreement. While Grim was seriously looking at Tigul, the goblin war god was also secretly observing every mysterious wizard in the camp. He had to admit that just based on their appearance, this batch of otherworld magi was indeed worthy of their name. Mysterious, strange, evil, and unexpectedly powerful. According to Tigul's understanding, when these wizards first appeared, there was only one, and that was the strange insect which wrapped in a thick black robe. His power was as strange and powerful as his appearance. Not only could he control terrifying scorpions, he could even transform his body into millions of invisible black beetles. With this strange and powerful ability, the goblins could not really hurt his body with their weapons. It was said that this terrifying insect which even survived a bombardment from the giant goblin cannon when he fought against Prince Gaz Ruvi. And the next time he appeared, the goblins could not even find any signs of weakness or injury on his body. An evil wizard that could not be killed no matter what. This, to Tigul, who knew the power of the giant goblin cannon, this was a terrifying opponent that he did not want to face. However, such an evil sorcerer was clearly at the edge of this sorcerer's camp. This could be seen from the order in which the agreement was passed around. Chapter 522. The fully deserving leader of the entire Magus camp was the terrifying Fire Magus, who had personally blown up the giant floating ship. The might he possessed left even Tygol feeling waves of dizziness and lingering fear when he thought about it. Let alone the fact that he wasn't in a magic machine. Even if he controlled the most powerful Grade 2 magic machine in the Goblin Plane, he still wouldn't be a match for this fire magus. The difference in strength and equipment between the two sides wasn't small. In a fair fight, Tigul estimated that a Grade 2 fire magus with full firepower could simultaneously deal with 2 to 3 Grade 2 magic machines. Although this was somewhat outrageous, when he considered that the other side was a magus from the powerful magus world, it didn't seem too hard to accept. As for the other magi in the camp, they all had terrifying strength that made Tigul feel extreme fear. Every single one of them exuded a powerful, demonic, and strange power. Most importantly, they were all women. No, a more accurate term would be female magi. The second to read the agreement was a tall, long-haired beauty with an outstanding temperament. Just by looking at her delicate and beautiful face and her gentle and refined temperament, it was hard to associate her with an evil magus. But for some reason, when Tigul's gaze fell on her body, his heart began to thump for no reason. When the other party sensed his spying and looked up, Tigul almost couldn't help but cry out in alarm. For no reason, he felt as if he had been completely seen through by the other party. He hadn't seen this terrifying magus in the last war, but now that she had suddenly appeared, it seemed that this group of magi also had the ability to continuously summon their companions. Tigul's perfectly round eyes widened as he continued to peep. The gorgeous female magus dressed in red armor with strange bat wings on her back was a terrifying cold-blooded killer. Moreover, she also had the strange ability to absorb blood and heal herself. However, the most frightening thing about her was her ghostly speed. Tigul, who had experienced how terrifying Mary was on the battlefield, felt his hair stand on end when he saw her. Apart from these people, there were 3 other female magi in the camp. The oldest among them was an old witch with a dark face and a hunched back. She was the powerful witch who had poisoned hundreds of goblin mechanics to death in one breath. Over 100 battle magic machines. Such a powerful force was enough to flatten any powerful race in the Goblin Plane, but in front of this old witch, they were as fragile as a flock of guinea fowls. Hundreds of battle magic machines roared as they charged at the old witch, only to be poisoned to death with a wave of the enemy's hand. As soon as that terrifying scene appeared in his mind, Tygol shuddered and didn't dare to think any further. In addition to the poisonous woman, there was also a strange half-human half-machine witch and a sturdy witch who was as strong as a man. It was also the first time it had seen the latter, so it should be a witch who had just arrived. As for the former, I had fought against her briefly on the floating airship. Although she wasn't as tyrannical as the fire shaman, her combat style and direction of development were quite similar to the goblins. If they weren't enemies, Tigul really wanted to find a chance to discuss the control of external magic machines with this mechanical witch. However, the goblins used exoskeleton-type magic machines, while the other party seemed to have fused with those magic machines. After Tigul looked at every magus in the camp with a fearful gaze, his gaze returned to the leader of the magi. The other party was also silently sizing him up. After stepping into the magic machine, Tigul would also have the strength of a Grade 2 magus. However, without the magic machine, he was still just a Grade 1 goblin mechanic. In terms of the basic quality of his body, the gap between him and Grimm's spiritual energy was so huge that it was hard to make up for it. When his gaze met Grimm's, Tigul felt a stinging pain in his eyes, as if they were being stabbed by needles. Only when he tilted his head and shifted his gaze away did he feel a little better. However, silent tears were already flowing down his face. Cooperation. Grimm's black pupils seemed so deep, and his voice was deep and powerful, vaguely carrying a domineering aura. Your princess has just been kidnapped by Gazruvi, and now you're here to talk about cooperation with us? I have every reason to suspect that this is a plot you've concocted in secret. Your Excellency's suspicion is completely understandable. Tigul's green face was full of frustration and sorrow. However, since I dared to come here, I naturally brought with me the official promise and agreement of the demi-royal family. Grimm's eyes flickered, and after a moment of silence, he finally spoke again. Then why don't you tell me what the immortality project that Gazruvi is working on in the Steel City is? Tigul hesitated for a moment before saying, since most of the control of the Steel City has fallen into the hands of the radical faction, the immortality project that they've been secretly working on there has been going on for 23 years. We've only managed to find out some insider information in recent years. This so-called immortality project is actually a research project that Gazruvi is using to extend his life. In order to live for a few more years, he's spent a huge amount of resources and wealth to support the research of inventors. The research includes many experiments on living subjects and experiments on the fusion of foreign bloodlines, but unfortunately, all of them have failed. However, that Gazruvi has used some unknown means to obtain immortality from a different plane. I heard that he's built a huge spatial furnace under the Steel City. Nominally, it's to provide Steel City with an inexhaustible supply of magic energy, but in fact, he's building a plane gate. A planar gate? Grimm suddenly interrupted, his voice filled with deep shock. Even in the Magus world, plane gates were the most confidential of secret. It was not high-ranked Magus knowledge that ordinary magi could dabble in. Every Magus who grasped the method to build a plane gate was a core Magus of a large organization, and their brains were also sealed by a powerful Magus of that organization. Any outsider who tried to pry into this part of Magus knowledge would trigger a backlash from the restriction, exploding the Magus head into a paste of blood and devouring their soul. It was through this method that the large organizations were able to firmly control the secrets of plane gates, making it a benefit that only large organizations could enjoy. Now, however, he'd actually heard news of a plane gate in an unremarkable small plane. How could this not make Grimm feel astonished and excited? With the level of the Goblin Plane civilization, it was impossible for them to develop the technology of a plane gate so quickly. Grimm had reason to suspect that this involved a high-ranked plane. As expected, Tygol's next words caused Grimm's expression to change slightly. The technological power of a plane gate has already exceeded the limits of our goblin civilization. It wasn't researched by Gazruvi himself, but came from a high-ranked plane of the draconic humans. Grimm's expression changed slightly. After analyzing the metal ball he'd obtained from Tygol, he'd obtained a set of strange world waymarks. Through the AI chip's research and analysis, he'd determined that it was a small plane that had developed to its peak. From Tygol's point of view, it was reasonable to call it a high-ranked plane. The plane of the draconic humans. Eternal Project, Steel City, Plane Gate. Prince Gazruvi had really done a lot of things. With such an opponent, Grimm did not have to worry about being lonely. Grimm listened attentively to Tygol's narration, interjecting with a few questions at every crucial point. Through this method, he roughly understood everything that had happened in the Goblin Plane. In the eyes of the powerful magi of the Magus world, no matter how powerful or intelligent the natives of a secondary plane were, once they were stripped of their skin, they were just monsters that were slightly stronger or smarter. No matter when or where, magi would never treat these goblins as intelligent creatures that could be compared to themselves, much less give them the right to be on equal footing. However, after hearing the rumors about this goblin prince, even Grimm had to admit that Gazruvi was indeed a rather special goblin. At the very least, his ability to stir up trouble was something that even Grimm had to concede. Ever since the old goblin Gazruvi sensed that he did not have much time left to live, he began to focus on the so-called Eternal Project. If he had only been conducting goblin experiments or dissecting living creatures in the Goblin Plane, he would not have been able to cause such chaos in the entire Goblin Empire. At the same time, he maintained a secret connection with 7 or 8 powerful beings from other planes. Through repeated transactions, he had also obtained a lot of knowledge and technology from other planes. After combining the knowledge from different planes, the old goblin Gaz-Ruvi actually took a different approach and came up with a completely different eternal project. It planned to dig out its own brain and soak it in a special life solution. Once it had grown to a certain extent, it would be transferred to a super magical machine made of all the special alloys and rare resources in the Goblin Plane. The huge spatial furnace under the Steel City was the heart he had prepared for himself, and the entire Steel City could be completely activated to become his new body. In order to do this, he could not do without the life energy of a large number of high-energy creatures. Originally, Gaz-Ruvi planned to lure a group of magi from the Magus world into his trap and then become his captives. Unfortunately, due to Alice's strange intuition, she did not manage to open a plane hole that led to the Silver Void Stone. Instead, she used chaotic teleportation to casually throw Bliss to a corner of the Goblin Plane. Chapter 523. The old goblin did not have much time left. The delay in capturing the wizards had left a huge loophole in its immortality plan that was difficult to make up for. In order to extend his life, he had no choice but to compromise with a powerful being from another plane. When the plane gate opened, the entire Goblin Plane would become a vassal of the Draken Empire. The old goblin would obtain the high-energy life form he was looking forward to, and successfully complete the transition from a flesh and blood life form to a magical life form. Originally, the Goblin royal family did not know about these secrets, but after Princess Vanessa was kidnapped and brought to the Steel City, the Goblin royal family sent a large number of spies and spies there, and accidentally discovered the old goblin's secret. Currently, most of the Goblin residents in the Steel City had been turned into laborers by the old goblin, working day and night to build the plane gate. Outside the Steel City, there were patrols from venture capital companies and mercenary camps everywhere, completely sealing off all roads and ports to the Steel City. On the other hand, the old goblin's private army retreated into the Steel City and turned it into a heavily guarded magical city. The old goblin's selfishness also caused the Goblin royal family to be surrounded by enemies. The evil magi were stirring up trouble in the plane, and the Draken Empire was eyeing the plane covetously outside. Even if they gathered all their strength to defeat the magi, they would not be able to escape the fate of being enslaved and pillaged by the Draken Empire. Thus, at this critical moment, the goblins finally lowered their heads and were prepared to reconcile with the magi and work together to foil the old goblin's plot. The Goblin royal family's document that Tigil brought stated that as long as the Magi helped the goblins defeat Gaz-Ruvi and the Draken Empire, the Goblin royal family would be willing to hand over part of their power and share the resources of the Goblin Plane with the Magi. Of course, Grimm accepted the suggestion of the Goblin royal family. Since he had come to the Goblin Plane, everything here was destined to become his territory and wealth. How could he allow another army from another plane to enter the Goblin Plane and fight for control of the plane with him? That old goblin was indeed a scourge. Leaving him alive had really dug a hole for him. Grimm knew very little about the Draken Plane. If they really encountered them in Steel City, Grimm was not confident that the 7 wizards could defeat an entire army on the other side. So in the end, Grimm's gaze involuntarily stopped on Alice's face. As if sensing the passion in Grimm's eyes, Alice smiled sweetly. "Since we're here, we must get something. Let's do it." With Alice's endorsement, Grimm's uneasy heart finally calmed down. "We agree to join forces." Grimm nodded to Tigila and said, "Then, do you have any specific battle plans?" "Infiltrate Steel City. Destroy the planar gate that's under construction. Rescue Princess Vanessa. Kill Gaz-Ruvi as the plenipotentiary representative. Tigul immediately explained the strategy to conquer Steel City in detail, and all the magi present quietly listened. 5 days later, outside Steel City. This was a sturdy mountain pass located in a gap in the mountain. The battle had just ended, and more than 30 goblin mercenaries stationed here had turned into corpses on the ground. The wolf dung on top of the mountain pass had been ignited, and billowing black smoke could be seen even from tens of miles away. A squad of goblin elites was quickly cleaning up the battlefield. Meanwhile, Tigul was accompanying 7 black-robed magi as they stood at the mountain pass, observing the Steel City that towered over a mountain peak several dozen miles away. This was a breathtaking city of steel. The entire city was located at the highest point of the snow-capped Sulai mountain range, and almost all of it was built with huge luo rocks and metal. The city was built against the mountain, and most of the buildings were located in the belly of the Sulai mountain range. The Steel City had 2 gates that were more than 30 meters tall, and on both sides of the gates were huge statues of goblin sages. Among them, the smallest statue was more than 20 meters tall, and all of them were exquisitely carved and looked lifelike. For ease of entry and exit, the Steel City had built a flat and solid stone road that could accommodate 5 goblin chariots at the same time. But at the moment there were 7 or 8 temporary camps on both sides of the stone road, and more than 1,000 goblin mercenaries were stationed there. If they wanted to force their way through, a bloody battle to the death was unavoidable. According to the goblin royal family's plan, a large number of royal guards and local legions would pass through Minar Pass and attack the gates of the Steel City from both east and west. Once they had restrained the main force of the goblin mercenaries, the Magic Corps and Magi, led by Tigul, would enter the Steel City through an underground tunnel. The gates of the Steel City were built for the convenience of goblin caravans, but it was too time-consuming and laborious to rely on caravans to transport large quantities of goods up the mountain. That was why the goblins used their proficient engineering skills to dig out an underground passageway that extended in all directions in the belly of the Steel City, and laid convenient steam train tracks there. Every day, the rumbling steam train would pass through the underground network that was as dense as a spider's web, transporting large amounts of coal, firewood, food, and fruits from the foot of the mountain, and then transporting the daily waste and construction waste produced in the Steel City out of the mountain. Without Tigul's guidance, Grim and the other Magi might not even be able to reach the inner city of the Steel City in 10 days. After all, every key node of the underground tunnel was guarded by the old goblins' private army. If a fight really broke out, the news of their arrival would not be able to be hidden. So, here, even Grim had to listen to Tigul's orders. They used a surprise attack to attack an entrance at the foot of the mountain, and then rode a steam train that was emitting black smoke, advancing into the depths of the mountain along the tracks. Some of the goblins that had been arranged beforehand became the captain of the train, while Grim and the others hid in large wooden boxes filled with oats and fruits. With the goblins' cover, they smoothly passed through the checkpoint. The steam train sped through the spacious underground tunnel, the high dome inlaid with illuminating crystals at regular intervals. When the train was about to reach the next checkpoint, the captain of the train, Dottle, sounded the whistle and closed the steam valve, causing the train to slow down. This was a temporary stop. On both sides of the platform, 2 large goblin chariots firmly occupied the most advantageous attacking positions. The magic cannons at the top of the chariots were aimed at the steam train that was slowly approaching. A goblin in a yellow uniform held up a red signal light, signaling for the train to stop. The steam train emitted thick black smoke as it slowly came to a stop in the middle of the platform, accompanied by the ear-piercing sound of chopping boards rubbing against the iron rails. Routine inspection. A small leader who looked like a goblin commander shouted in a low voice, "What's in this carriage?" "It's all oats and fruits." Dottle, who had been hiding here for a while, stuck half his body out of the locomotive and replied loudly. His body and face were covered in soot from the black smoke, so he did not have to worry about being recognized. Open the carriage. Everything has to be inspected. The small leader shouted rudely, waving his arms. There's still inspection? From the entrance to here, it's already been inspected 7 times. Why is there still more? Dottle muttered, pretending to be dissatisfied. If this drags on, this batch of fruits will go bad. When that happens, you can just wait to eat rotten apples and rotten bananas. Hurry up and open it. Don't talk so much nonsense. The small leader gritted his teeth. Do you think we want to go through so much trouble? This is an order from the higher-ups of the company. All trains entering the steel capital must be strictly inspected. The goblin guards swarmed forward and forcefully pulled open the iron barrel-like carriage, only to see large wooden boxes stacked to the brim. The wooden boxes at the door had already been pried open, revealing golden tangerines, dates, muga fruits, sala fruits. A few hungry goblins stuffed the fruits into their mouths. The sweet honey immediately flowed down the corners of their mouths, and the goblins at the back were starving. What are you all so anxious for? The small leader raised his whip and lashed out fiercely. Finish your work first. After the inspection, carry 2 boxes of fruits to the platform. Are you still worried that you won't have anything to eat? Hurry, hurry, hurry. Get to work first. Under the urging of the small leader, the goblin guards began to inspect the goods within the wooden boxes one by one. However, just as one of the goblin guards pried open a particularly large wooden box, the fruits inside suddenly flowed out like a flood. A tall metal body stood up from the wooden box. Magic machinery! There was a magic machinery hidden in the wooden box. The goblin guards were so frightened that they covered their heads and scurried away. The small leader who was at the back of the group leapt back to the platform and shouted at the goblin chariot in the distance. Open fire! Open fire! There are enemies inside! However, what surprised him was that no matter how much he shouted and waved his arms, the goblin chariot did not move in the slightest. Instead, a mass of black smoke spread out from the chariot, condensing into a mysterious black robe in the empty space beside the chariot. Wizard! Wizard! Looking at this scene, how could the small leader not understand that his group had encountered the most terrifying evil magi? Not bothering to command the motley crew, the small leader ran toward the nearest emergency exit in a flash. As long as he entered the exit with his familiarity with the underground tunnel, he was confident that he could shake off any pursuers. Chapter 524. Mary put down the crimson longbow in her hands after casually killing a goblin that was running away. In just a short while, the 31 goblin guards that occupied the platform were all killed. Their corpses were piled up in the carriage and buried by fruit. At this point, there was no longer a need for the ambush team to hide their identities. The terrain here extended in all directions. Even if the old goblin Gaz Ruvi knew of their arrival, it would be difficult for him to completely block them in the underground tunnels. While sniffing the strange and peculiar scent in the underground tunnel, Alice's beautiful face revealed a trace of solemnity. I smell the aura of another world here. Aura of another world? You mean? Grim was slightly taken aback as he asked softly. I suspect that the goblin royal family's information is not accurate. It's very likely that the dimension gate has already been built. Alice replied softly. The conversation between the two was conducted through spiritual undulations, and they did not turn their backs on the Magi on their side. As for the goblins, as they did not know how to use their spiritual force, they were completely unaware of their conversation. Understood. Grim nodded. In this steel city, we might not only encounter Gaz Ruvi's magic mechanical army. It's very likely that there will be other armies from other planes. Everyone, be careful. The few Magi looked at each other, and after making up their minds, they silently turned into the nearby underground tunnels. The group that had been gathered together just a moment ago immediately split into a dozen teams of various sizes. They passed through the densely packed underground tunnels and headed towards different areas of the Steel City. Grim, Alice, Sophia, and Mary went to the depths of the mountain, where the old goblin was probably hiding. Bliss went to the lower city, where he would create a huge commotion to cover the movements of the other regions. Sabrina and Ender went to the inner city to see if they could find anything there. As for the goblins, apart from Tygol, who brought 10 magic machinery and followed Grim to look for the old goblin, the rest of the goblins snuck into various parts of the city in search of Princess Vanessa. This was a huge cave in the depths of the mountain. Because it was man-made, the cave here was not as uneven as a natural cave, and there were no huge stone pillars, stalagmites, or stone peaks in the cave. This place was clearly located 1,000 meters below the mountain, but it didn't feel dark or damp at all. On the walls of the cave, there were holes of various sizes, and white steam filled the air. In the middle of the cavern, a huge, capsule-shaped metal can stood tall, with violent and ferocious magical energy churning inside. Numerous metal pipes were connected to the tank, guiding the filtered pure magical energy to different areas in an orderly manner. With the endless energy output of this massive spatial furnace, the entire steel capital was like a massive munitions factory that was operating at full capacity. Every day, 25 combat magic machines and over 100 goblin chariots and goblin tanks would come out of the assembly line. As for the other goblin guns and magic cannons, they were only affected by the production of special alloys. As long as the outside world brought in the metals and rare resources needed for construction machinery, the steel capital would be able to convert them into offensive magic weapons, and then arm the old goblin private army that was gathered here. Meanwhile, adjacent to the cavern hall where the spatial furnace was located, in a newly excavated underground hall, a semicircular arched door made of pure metal machinery was surging with dense sky-blue energy tides, the spatial fluctuations also becoming more and more frequent. At this moment, mysterious runes were lighting up one after another on the metal arch. Every time a rune lit up, a strange energy would gather at the spatial singularity in the middle of the arch. As the magical energy gathered, the spatial singularity started to open up, and a huge door of light that covered the entire arch was pulled open. One by one, the goblin engineers gathered around the arched door, carefully controlling the input of magical energy while wearing a pair of thick spectacles, recording the mysterious runes one by one. On a high platform opposite the door of light, Gazlervi, who was extremely weak, wore an exquisite suit and reclined on a soft chair. There were many tubes inserted into his body, which led to the bottles of nutrient fluids of various colors behind the chair. Pay attention to maintaining the stability of the door of light, and set the energy output threshold at 1.77 hectare. Although there were signs of decay in his body, Gazlervi was still calmly commanding everything. The goblin engineers and alchemists present were all obedient to this old goblin who was on his last breath. In the region of the steel capital, the old goblin had a huge influence that even the goblin emperor could not compare to. Even if he wanted any of the goblins present to die, they would not hesitate to carry out the order, and even die happily. To them, it was an extreme honor to be able to do anything for the spiritual leader of the goblins. Even death was a matter full of honor. Under the old goblin's command, after the huge door of light stabilized for a quarter of an hour, ripples suddenly appeared in the center of the sky-blue door of light, and a tall and mighty figure came out. It was a strange creature that was half human, half beast. It was more than 3 meters tall, more than 2 meters wide, and 5 meters long from head to tail. It had a thick and sturdy human upper body, but its lower body was like that of a beast, with 4 thick hooves and a flat, thick, long tail on its back. Its head had a slightly blunt nose, a hard forehead, and layers of wrinkles on its cheeks and ears. Its hands and feet were in the shape of dragon claws, with sharp and hard claws. The surface of its body was densely covered with thick, dark green scales, and its muscles were bulging. Regardless of whether it was his arms, neck, or the remaining 4 short legs, they were all so thick and powerful. At first glance, one would feel a sense of oppression from his overflowing strength. This was a pure half-dragon, also known as a dragonman. It was a strange creature formed by the mixing of human and dragon bloodlines. Their intelligence was not very high, but they had a strong body and powerful magical abilities, and under the influence of the dragon bloodline, their magic resistance was outstanding. If it was not for the fact that they could not fly, they could even be regarded as the branch with the most powerful individual combat power among the descendants of the dragon bloodline. The half-dragon that stepped out of the plane gate was obviously a guy with grade 1 strength. Although this level was not very good in the plane, it was more than enough to crush these fragile goblins. That was why when the draken swayed its thick waist and its 4 hooves stepped firmly on the metal floor, the goblin engineers surrounding the metal arch couldn't help but take a few steps back. Every single one of them stared at the ferocious demon with fearful and uneasy eyes. The half-dragon's body and magic resistance were as strong as described in the book. After stepping out of the plane gate, it only took a slight shake of its head to overcome the discomfort of the plane suppression. Of course, this also had a subtle relationship with the misty red light that was constantly emitted from the inside of the plane gate. The half-dragon shook its head, and soon its unfocused eyes returned to normal. Its strange amber-shaped vertical pupils contracted twice, and immediately stared at Gaz Ruvi on the high platform in the distance. Although the old goblin Gaz Ruvi was on the high platform, when the half-dragon walked to the front of the platform, their gazes were almost parallel. "You are that little goblin?" The half-dragon's voice was as loud as a bell, so loud that the goblins on the platform could not help but cover their ears. "You've done well. Once we have a foothold here, we will definitely reward you greatly." The half-dragon did a simple inspection of the plane gate, and was obviously very satisfied with the goblin's work. However, its tone of praise was very stiff, as if it was giving a dog a meat bone with contempt and disdain. "Lord Songlin, why is it only you? Didn't you say that a combat team of 30 people would come first?" The old goblin Gaz Ruvi asked in a low voice with a sluggish face. "Humph. You have cut corners on this plane gate. There are too many things missing on it, and it cannot support the arrival of a grade 3 duke. Now that I'm here, get your people to retreat from here, and don't enter without being summoned. It's not up to you to interfere with the affairs of us half-dragons." Perhaps it sensed the weakness of the goblins present. Songlin the half-dragon? Thunderlight's tone became extremely impatient. In its opinion, these weak goblins who could not even withstand its dragon breath had no right to talk to a half-dragon marquis. If it did not need these trash for the subsequent energy support, it would have turned them into charcoal with its violent lightning power. Hearing the half-dragon's disdainful words, the goblins' expressions changed slightly. Some goblin engineers even secretly took out their walkie-talkies, and were about to summon the magic weapon corps guarding outside the hall. Yes. Who would have thought that the old goblin Gaz Ruvi was not angry at the half-dragon's reprimand? Instead, he smiled apologetically and gestured for the people beside him to lift the soft chairs and slowly leave the plane hall. When they were far enough away, the group of goblin engineers crowded around Gaz Ruvi and asked softly, "Lord Prince, you mean?" Chapter 525. What a despicable and filthy world. Everywhere is filled with a disgusting stench, Songlin. Lightning shook its head that resembled a giant dragon, the vertical pupils in its 4 ferocious beast-like eyes constantly expanding and contracting, emitting an amber radiance. Moreover, its powerful spiritual senses far surpassed creatures of the same tier. Even if the goblins were far away, every word they said could be heard by the dragonoid eunuch without missing a word. Once all the goblins had left the plane hall, the dragonborn put away the unruliness and irritation on its face. Its eyes turned round and round, revealing the light of reason unique to intelligent creatures. Most dragonborn were indeed fools with great strength but no brains. However, being appointed by the Duke to be the scout of the Dragonborn's advance guard, it meant that this Songlin, lightning, definitely had its own unique ability. It strode forward with its 4 thick hooves. Songlin? Lei Guang carefully inspected the entire planar hall. When he was sure there weren't any problems, he took out 3 lightning stones and threw them at the door of light. As the 3 gems touched the sky-blue door of light, the originally grayish-white stones emitted a terrifying surge of lightning energy. When the 3 gems were embedded into the metal arch in a triangular formation, an alternative triangular spatial passage was born at the center of the door. When the spatial passage gradually stabilized, the pitch-black light barrier rippled and 20 to 30 Songlin phantoms emerged from it. Lightning were powerful dragonborn of similar size. The enormous plain hall looked very spacious, able to accommodate almost 1,000 goblins without being too cramped. But now only 35 Dragonians had squeezed in, and it already gave off a feeling that the place was full. When the 35 Draconid vanguard were all present, the pitch-black spatial tunnel suddenly trembled violently, as if a huge fellow was stuck inside, unable to enter or retreat. Thus, the spatial passage began to expand slowly, emitting strange sounds as if the space was under severe stress. Finally, with a dull pop, a dragonborn that was far stronger than Songlin, the Draconid, whose body was even larger and stronger than the lightning, struggled to break free from the shackles of space, and began to appear in this world. Praise be to you, our leader, Lord Zakar, welcome, Sir Zacha. Just as the powerful Draconid leader steadied himself, every Draconid scout in the hall could not help but bow, pressing their indigo-scaly right hands on their chests and bowing in unison. The scouts selected to join the Dragonoid advance guard were at least Tier 1 in strength, and this scout leader was obviously a Tier 2 powerhouse. When it appeared, covered in a dazzling blue radiance, an invisible force of the plane of existence wrapped around its body, causing it to groan uncontrollably even though it was a Grade 2 powerhouse from another plane. Although they were both otherworld creatures, the dimensional suppression that a Tier 2 creature had to endure was obviously far greater than that of a Tier 1 creature. Fortunately, aside from the innate abilities brought about by the giant dragon's bloodline, the Draconians also had a tough and tyrannical body. Even if they were temporarily unable to use their innate spells, just relying on their tyrannical bodies was enough to crush most of their enemies. Kid from the Songlin clan, how's the situation here? Even though he was still suffering from the terrifying suppression of the plane, the scout leader who had appeared last still displayed a powerful strength that made people's hearts palpitate. Leader Zacha, that goblin is indeed untrustworthy. From the construction of the plane gate, it can be seen that it was constructed with the lowest quality of magic materials. It cannot be used for long. Also what? The energy source of the plane gate seems to be a little strange. It contains some superficial knowledge from the Magus world. That's why I'm worried that we might meet some unexpected enemies in this invasion. Magus world, upon hearing that name, the Dragonman scouts couldn't help but frown. Zacha, the leader of the scouts, had a slight change in expression, and a foot-long bolt of lightning shot out from his amber-like vertical pupils. Where's that goblin that made a deal with us? Zacha's mood was unprecedentedly bad when he heard such bad news the moment he arrived. He could not help but snarl coldly. I've already chased him out of the plane hall. I'm worried that they'll tamper with the energy supply of the plane gate. As long as we cut off the energy supply, they'll be able to cut off our path of retreat. Songlin? Lightning Ray was obviously a rare wise man among the Draconids. Although he was still young, only 103 years old, his judgment was reasonable. As if in a hurry to confirm his deduction, the lights in the plane hall suddenly went out, and the energy that was continuously being channeled into the plane gate began to quickly dissipate. The huge door of light within the metal arch was already dimming at a speed visible to the naked eye. Only the triangular spatial passage, supported by the lightning stones, was still emitting a hazy fluorescence. Ha! These cunning and despicable goblins really think that they can cut off our path of retreat by cutting off the energy supply? Zacha shouted in a low voice, "Lightning Ray, take 5 people with you to guard the plane gate. You must not let the plane gate close or be destroyed. Here, these are the 300 lightning stones that I've specially brought for this trip. They'll be enough to support the plane gate for a month." Having said that, Zacha took out a huge bag made of animal skin from his back. When the bag landed on the ground, the unfastened opening of the bag opened, and hundreds of dazzling and blinding blue lights shot out from within. "Understood, leader." Song Lin? Lightning Ray waved his hand, and 5 members of his team swarmed near the metal arch. They pulled out their lightning spears and entered a state of high alert. However, at this moment, a loud metallic rumble came from the entrance of the plane hall. Neatly arranged combat magical machines, goblin chariots with eerie muzzles, and teams of fully armed goblin warriors surged in like a tide. Facing such a lineup, how could the Draconids not understand the intentions of the goblins? Draconid warriors, charge! The Zachary leader raised his 3-meter-long lightning spear and roared, "Blast these untrustworthy goblins into smithereens for me." Following Zacha's order, the Draconid scouts swayed their fat bodies and galloped, holding their lightning spears as they charged towards the goblin army. There were only 30 Draconid scouts charging, but they gave off a heroic feeling as if thousands of soldiers and horses were galloping. A Draconid weighed about 30 tons, and 30 Draconids added up to over 1,000 tons. Can you imagine the scene of a terrifying monster that is made up of thousands of tons of sturdy flesh, sturdy bones, and shockingly strong scales charging at you with heavy, rumbling footsteps? Loud rumbles echoed in the belly of the mountain, and all sorts of strange sounds intertwined together, making people want to cover their ears and not hear them. Unlike the direct charge of the Draconid scouts, the goblin army had a clear hierarchy. At the front was, of course, the invincible magic machine squad. They were divided into 3 rows, and each row had 5 combat magical machines that were 3 meters tall. Once the Draconids entered their firing range, the magic machine squad would open fire, using a terrifying barrage of metal bullets to stop the Draconids' assault. Ordinary metal bullets did not pose much of a threat to the Draconids. After all, the Draconids' indigo scales were enough to resist any physical or magical attacks of less than 25 degrees. However, the power of the berserk bullets was not so easily dispelled. Even the mighty Draconid warrior could not help but slow down when the torrent of 7 to 8 metal pellets crashed against his scales, making it difficult for him to even move. Occasionally, the pained groans of the Draconid warriors could be heard as their scales were pierced. But the valiant Draconid warriors were fearless. They raised their left arm to block their vulnerable face while bellowing and raising an aqua-blue lightning barrier in front of them. With the lightning barrier in charge of dispelling the power of the metal bullets, the Draconids' speed increased again. Behind the magic machine squad, the goblin war chariot quickly swerved to the sides and calmly unfolded its metal supports. Only then did a pitch-black cannon barrel with a diameter of 1 meter poke out from the bottom of the chariot. The all-metal magical cannons were forged from special alloy materials. As magical energy filled the cannons emitted a dark red radiance. Thud, 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 fireballs imbued with berserk magical energy drew beautiful arcs in the air and landed at the front of the battlefield, where they exploded into a huge, dazzling sea of fire. Faced with such a violent and concentrated energy attack, if it was any other opponent, they would have to retreat for a while. But against the energy fireballs that surged at them like cannons, the Draconid warriors were even braver and more fearless. They roared in the strange draconic language that was incomprehensible to outsiders. When they approached the magic machines at the front lines, the lightning spears in their hands, suddenly shot out streaks of blinding, and terrifying lightning chains. The violent and ferocious lightning bolts bounced off the battle magic machines one after another. Every time they turned, they would inflict indescribable damage to the metal machines that they passed through. The 10 magic machines at the front lines of the goblin army were instantly turned into dazzling fireballs without any resistance. The goblin mechanics hidden deep within them were instantly turned into charcoal. The goblin army clearly did not expect the Draconids to have such powerful lightning abilities in their first battle against the Draconid. What was even more tragic was that the magic machines were made of high-strength alloy materials that were not insulated. Therefore, as the best conductor of lightning, not only could the magic machines not protect the goblin mechanics within them, they would also allow them to absorb more lightning energy. Chapter 526. It was the first round of the battle. The Dragonoid warriors were slightly injured, while the goblin army was heavily injured. As the Dragonoid warriors charged into the goblin army, the casualties of the goblin army skyrocketed to a point where it was almost unbearable to look at. With the protection of its metal shell, the goblins were able to accurately conceal their weak strength and low combat ability. However, the destructive power that they could unleash was mainly provided by the magical weapons and explosive weapons carried by the metal goblins. Although the attacks of these weapons were endless, there was an obvious upper limit to their power. For example, the explosive weapons were mainly metal projectiles propelled by high-explosive explosive. However, for such attacks, no matter how perfect the craftsmanship was and how well-designed the weapons were, the upper limit of the physical damage would not exceed 30 degrees. Magical weapons, on the other hand, mainly relied on magical energy stimulated by magical batteries. When the violent magical energy accumulated to a certain extent, it would naturally cause considerable energy damage to the creatures of the plane. However, the magical weapons developed by the goblins were clearly low-end goods, and the energy damage they caused hovered between 35 to 80 degrees. Although such intensity was enough to cause a certain amount of damage to the Dragonoids, it was a pity that the wounds were only superficial and not fatal. Meanwhile, the Dragonoid warriors who were blasted by the magical fireballs did not retreat. Instead, they became even more valiant and violent. They waved the lightning spears in their hands, using chain lightning from afar and stabbing and smashing with the spears at close range. Every close-range attack was usually accompanied by a rampaging tide of thunder and lightning. The scattered lightning clearly could not break through the extraordinary magic resistance of the Dragonoid warriors. They were directly blocked by the indigo dark scales and could not hurt them at all. However, the goblin army that was fighting them could not do the same. The goblin army did not have an advantage in terms of size, weight, or attack power. Moreover, they were constantly emitting sparks from the lightning. Therefore, when the goblin army engaged in a chaotic battle, the goblin army was almost completely crushed by the Dragonoid warriors. Even as the defense line of the goblin army was broken, the goblin army behind them was also attacked by the Dragonoid warriors. The goblin warriors scattered around the goblin army to protect the goblin army became the targets of the Dragonoid warriors. It wasn't that the weapons developed by the goblin engineers were useless, it was just that their individual power was too weak. It would be difficult for them to break through the lightning barrier and the tough and impenetrable scales of the Draconians. So once the defensive line was breached, the combat strength of the entire goblin army began to rapidly decline. One by one, the gnome warriors were chased away by the dragonmen. They couldn't even maintain their defensive line, let alone launch an orderly attack. In less than 15 minutes, the 30 Dragonoid warriors dispersed the 700-strong goblin army, and the number of goblins that died on the battlefield was as high as 300. As for the dragonmen, there were no casualties. Although most of the Draconids' bodies had sporadic damage and wounds, as time went on, those wounds were closing and healing at a visible speed. From this, one could see the terrifying regenerative ability of the Dragonman race. As the goblins fled, the Dragonoid scouts split into 10 squads, each consisting of 3 Dragonoid. They chased after the goblins and slaughtered wantonly. Given the Dragonmen's usual style of governance, they would first slaughter their opponents before taking them in as servants. On one hand, it was a way to vent their wild and violent instincts, while on the other, it was a way to establish the glorious image of the Dragonmen as powerful and invincible. As the scattered gnomes fled in all directions, in the underground tunnels of the Steel City, a hunt and a counter-hunt were taking place at the same time. A goblin chariot that had escaped from the battlefield roared as it charged out from the other end of the tunnel. Its metal wheels spun madly on the stone floor, sparks flying everywhere as it left 2 clear tracks behind it. The goblin chariot staggered forward, kicking up dazzling sparks against the stone walls of the tunnel even as it charged the magical cannons at the top of the chariot, bombarding the massive silhouette that was hot on its tail. Meanwhile, the flintlock at the back of the chariot also fired streaks of metal, hitting the aqua-blue lightning barrier in front of the silhouette and causing it to crackle. If it had gotten any closer, the goblin chariot would have fired another stream of crimson flames, engulfing the massive silhouette and everything around it in the surging flames. Unfortunately, even if the goblin chariot unleashed 200% of its combat power, it could not effectively harm the terrifying silhouette that was hot on its tail. Most of the time, the goblin chariot would even drift left and right across a wide area under the crazy chariot captain's control to shake off the dazzling bolts of lightning that were hurtling towards it. Although the goblin chariot's attacks could only deal minuscule damage to the Dragonmen, the cumulative damage was considerable. But now that it lacked the protection of combat magic machinery, the goblin chariot could only run and fight, doing its best to create trouble for the enemy. The goblin chariot could not harm the Dragonmen, but on the other hand, the Dragonmen's attacks would definitely pierce through the 50-centimeter thick steel plates of the goblin chariot. As for the goblins wearing thin leather armor inside the chariot, they would instantly be reduced to ashes. After all, most goblin warriors were ordinary creatures, and their basic attributes were incomparable to the Dragonmen. Without the protection of the chariot, they were like a pile of ashes before the Dragonmen. They would be gone if the Dragonmen used a little more strength. The chariot was running wildly, the cannons were roaring furiously, and the churning crimson flames surged in the tunnel. However, the Dragonman warrior did not seem to feel anything, and kept swaying its heavy body as it chased after the chariot. Due to the complexity and twists of the underground tunnel, it had already lost contact with its 2 companions. However, the little rat that was running away in front of it had successfully incited its rage, and it followed behind the Dragonman without a care in the world, passing through one tunnel after another and turning one corner after another. However, just as they darted into a rather narrow passageway, the furious and berserk Draconid scout suddenly stopped. Its triangular draconic head looked left and right swiftly, the lightning spear in its hand glinting with electricity, occasionally unleashing frightening bolts that wandered about. Asterisk thud 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 thud. Asterisk 4 dull thuds rang out consecutively. 4 different combat machines appeared before the Draconid's eyes from both sides of the tunnel. 2 at the front and 2 at the back, perfectly sealing off the Dragonman's escape routes. It's a trap. The Dragonman scout did not even need to guess what was hidden behind the scene before it. Although it had fallen into the enemy's trap, the Dragonman scout did not show any fear. Instead, it slowly moved its neck and wrists, swinging its lightning spear like the wind and taking the initiative to attack the 2 enemies in front of it. 4 Grade 2 magic machinery. On the surface, it seemed that the goblins had the absolute advantage on the battlefield and could take down the Dragonman scout that had fallen into their death trap with a small price. However, as the battle began, a duel that left the goblins humiliated happened. Out of confidence, the 4 goblins only sent a Grade 2 magic machinery to face the Grade 1 Dragonman scout. However, the outcome of the duel was beyond their expectations. The Grade 1 Dragonman scout actually killed the Grade 2 magic machinery with moderate injuries. Even the goblin mechanic that was hiding in the magic machinery was torn apart by the Dragonman scout and smashed into meat paste. The goblins had originally regarded the biological hierarchy as the standard, but there were huge and insurmountable differences between different species. The combat magic machinery that the goblins regarded as a Grade 2 powerhouse had every single mechanical parameter that seemed to reach the standard of a Grade 2 creature. However, when they were grouped together, they still could not reach the true combat strength of a Grade 2 creature. In fact, in the eyes of some of the powerful Grade 1 creatures, the goblins' Grade 2 magic machinery was just a slightly troublesome toy. The weak body of the goblin mechanic was obviously unable to unleash the full power of the Grade 2 magic machinery, wasting a huge amount of resources. This undoubtedly made the goblin engineers, inventors, and alchemists hiding far away and watching the battle with their long-range lenses grieve. Hence, this tragic duel made the goblins realize once again the huge difference in strength between them and the invaders from the other plane. The otherworldly invaders from the higher planes weren't stronger than them in just one aspect. Rather, they were more powerful in all aspects. While the goblins secretly mocked the dragonmen as a bunch of idiots with muscles but no brains, they did not understand that when a species reached a certain level of strength, it would no longer bother to play tricks and so-called strategies. No matter who the enemy was, no matter what the enemy wanted to do, the dragonmen only needed to brace the enemy's cannons and charge in front of them and smash them into meat paste with a single punch. At a time like this, there was no place for crafty plots and schemes. Even strategies and tactics were no longer important. That was why it was not that the dragonmen were brainless, but that they would not bother to play tricks on a bunch of weak goblins. After verifying their combat strength and following the orders of the goblin higher-ups, the remaining 3 Grade 2 magic machinery swarmed forward and finally defeated the dragonman at the cost of 1 heavy injury and 2 light injuries. Then, a modified goblin war chariot dragged the draconid captive away at top speed. By the time the other 2 Dragonman scouts followed the lingering scent in the air and rushed over, there were no other living beings on the battlefield other than broken pieces of magic machinery and a large puddle of blue blood. The Dragonmen were not stupid, and they quickly noticed the abnormality through the traces of the battlefield. Hence, with a series of strange roars that were either long or short, thick or thin, the Dragonman scouts quickly reported the situation to their companions. Chapter 527. The pitch-black passageway continued to extend in front of them. Due to malicious destruction, the energy pipes connecting to various places were leaking in many places. This also caused most of the lighting devices in the passageway to be extinguished, with only a few areas barely able to maintain illumination. The chaotic magical energy that leaked in the passageway also caused the distortion, weakening, and disorder of spiritual perception, making it difficult for outsiders like the Magi and Dragonborn to control the situation with their powerful spiritual force. At this moment, the underground passageway of the Steel City was like a pool of dirty water that had been stirred up. All the strong, weak, and not too strong were mixed in, vainly trying to take advantage of the chaos to usurp the biggest share of benefit. Among them, there were both predators and prey. Of course, there were even more fools who were prey but vainly wanted to be a predator. In the darkness, Mary was wrapped in a bloody fog, her bat wings gently flapping as she slid silently along the ceiling of the passageway. Along the way, everything that could give off light was destroyed by her, which made the endless darkness the main theme of the entire underground passageway. Below her, the panicked goblin warriors were running around crying for their parent. In a situation where there was no light, they were like blind people with their eyes wide open as they crashed into the stone walls and metal pillars, causing their heads to bleed profusely. In such a dangerous environment, any wise predator would not easily expose its position. They hid in the darkness, hiding beside the chaotic goblins, silently waiting for the real prey to take the bait. The scattered goblin army was undoubtedly the abandoned pawns of the old goblin, Gaz Ruvi. They ran around randomly in the passageways, indirectly scattering the predators one by one. This way, the assembled elite goblins had the ability to counterattack, and could use their powerful and condensed strength to extinguish these powerful outsiders one by one. Meanwhile, in this region, the Draconid scouts began to spread out with the Plain Hall as the center, wiping out any goblins that posed a threat. As for the Magi, without knowing the existence of the Dragonborn, they were also advancing from the periphery of the passageway to the core area. Both sides were like two octopuses, each casting their own strength into the battlefield. As the circle of battle closed in, as the forces of both sides intertwined, some conflicts became inevitable. If others were said to be assassins in the dark, then Mary would be the king in the dark. When she flapped her wings and flew over the enemy's heads, most of the weak goblins couldn't even detect her presence. However, these low-level trash obviously could not attract her attention. Therefore, Mary had been advancing towards the core area of the underground and did not stop for the trash under her. When she flew out of a long and narrow tunnel and entered a cross-shaped intersection, the thick smell of blood that assaulted her immediately shook her spirit. Mary hovered silently under the high dome of the crossroads. Her scarlet eyes quickly scanned the area below her. There used to be a team of 50 goblins stationed here. They had magical machinery, chariots, and magical weapons. Their combat power was considerable. But at this moment, all of this had already become the past. Everything had become fragmented, and the ground was a complete mess. The magic machines and chariots were destroyed by violent means. The expensive magical equipment had already been reduced to scattered parts, and there were deep pits left on the ground, as if they had been smashed by a huge demon. Among the messy metal fragments, there were broken and twisted bodies of the goblins, as well as puddles of black blood. Mary followed the direction of the bloodstains and her gaze landed on a pitch-black tunnel. It seemed that someone had already hunted here, and they were heading there. Without thinking, Mary spread her bat wings and turned into a ray of red light that darted into the tunnel, gliding quickly along the pitch-black tunnel. This was simply a path of slaughter. Along the way, there were broken pieces of magical machinery and goblin chariots everywhere. The remains of the goblin machinists were mostly incomplete, like broken toys that were played with by the enemy. After flying for half a mile, Mary finally caught up to the group of enemies. Under the cover of 4 to 5 goblin warriors, the remaining 2 combat machinery were fighting against 3 tall and burly monsters. In fact, it could not be called a battle, but a game of death. Without a sturdy defense line and heavy firepower, the combat machinery and the magical weapons of the goblin warriors could barely deal any damage to the enemy. The 3 half-dragon, half-human ferocious demons used a blue lightning barrier to block the attacks of the goblins, and charged at their defense line like berserk warriors. The blue lightning barrier, the tough indigo scales, the incomparably powerful and imposing body with their huge body advantage, the defensive line that the goblins had just set up collapsed in an instant and was crushed into pieces by the enemy's sturdy bodies. A combat machinery fell to the ground in a crooked manner, barely stopping the 3 draconians with its violent barrage of attack. The rest of the goblins and the last combat machinery scattered, no longer able to move as a group, and fled into the nearby tunnels. Sambella, Ehamder, Gulliot. The Draconian scout in the lead shouted a few words in Draconic, and his 2 companions immediately turned around and chased after the Draconians with a menacing smile. As for itself, it walked towards the broken magic machinery with steady step. The violent barrage of metal bullets landed on the blue lightning barrier, and the torrential metal bullets stopped abruptly. The lightning barrier absorbed all of their kinetic energy, and they lined up densely on the blue lightning barrier. Even if some of the bullets managed to pierce through the gaps in the lightning barrier and nailed into the draconians' bodies, they were deflected by their indigo scales, and the round bullets were even twisted into flat metal pieces. Metal barrage, blazing flames, iron punches, even after using every method, it could hardly cause visible damage to the draconians' bodies. Just as the goblin mechanic knew that it was unlikely to survive and was about to self-destruct the goblin rocket at close range, the lightning spear in the dragonoid's hand suddenly pierced through the 30-centimeter-thick metal shield and pierced right through its heart. Then, as the lightning spear exploded, sparks flew from within the magic machinery, and it exploded into a rain of spare parts. The draconian scout grinned as it retrieved its lightning spear. Just as it was about to leave, its body suddenly stiffened. It abruptly turned around, and the 4 amber vertical pupils on its head quickly caught sight of a delicate figure standing proudly in the air, as well as the huge bat wings behind her. "Verna Tower, who are you?" The draconian scout roared loudly in Draconic, and for the first time, a strong sense of danger rose in its heart. Unfortunately, the other party did not seem to be interested in the Draconic language. It did not respond, and merely hovered in the air, staring coldly at it with its bloody pupils. The draconian scout switched to another 4 languages, as if it did not want to recklessly start a fight with the other party. Unfortunately, its opponent was Mary, a doer who always acted faster than she thought. As the blood mist on Mary's body surged, she raised her beautiful face and let out a soft whistle, folding her bat wings and diving down. The draconian scout did not dare to be as careless as it was against the goblins. It raised the lightning spear in its hand, and a forked bolt of lightning shot out. The lightning barrier in front of it also flashed with electricity, and the power of the lightning increased by more than 3 times. However, Mary's speed was clearly beyond its expectations. Her blood-colored body turned continuously in the air, leaving behind a series of afterimages, and before the draconian scout could react, she had already brushed past the edge of the lightning barrier and flew past it. Bam! A bowstring exploded. A blood-colored arrow abruptly pierced through the draconian's thick neck, leaving a round, bloody hole there. If it was an ordinary person who suffered such a terrifying injury, they would have long since died. However, as expected of a fearsome creature with tenacious vitality, the draconian scout did not die even with a hole in its neck. Instead, it covered the wound on its neck with one hand and sealed its blood vessels with the power of lightning. Then, it raised its lightning spear and chased after Mary, bombarding her nimble figure with blue lightning bolt. The brush with the draconian scout just now had also caused a strand of lightning to wrap around Mary's body. Although she was protected by the blood mist, the violent lightning still blasted the 3 blood-colored roses on the surface of the blood-colored war armor. This also indicated that if the draconian's lightning attacks landed, it would also have the terrifying power to injure Mary. However, Mary was, after all, a fearsome Tier 1 elite sorcerer from the sorcerer world, while the draconian scout was just an ordinary Tier 1 draconian from a small plane. Although both sides seemed to have the same starting point, their true combat power was worlds apart. Mary did not use her true strength at all. Instead, she relied on her far superior agility to circle around the draconian scout. Once the draconian scout revealed an opening, she would close in and fire with her blood-colored bow. The draconid scout could only roar in grief and indignation against such a cautious vampire sorcerer whose abilities far surpassed his own, and frantically flung lightning energy at Mary's afterimage beside him. Unfortunately, all its attacks missed, while Mary's attacks landed solidly on the draconian scout's body. Neck, heart, abdomen, right eye, back of tail, the blood-colored arrows pierced through the creature's weak and fatal spots. Due to the presence of witchcraft, the draconian's innate scales and lightning barrier could no longer protect it from the enemy's attack. Be it the blood-colored arrow's physical attacks or the blood mist and shadow damage, the draconian scout could not withstand them. As its vital organs were destroyed and its life force rapidly drained, the draconian scout finally collapsed to the ground, howling in pain. It could no longer stand on its own. It was then that Mary hurriedly pounced on the draconian's stalwart body. Sharp fangs that had been cute and adorable suddenly expanded, stabbing into the draconian scout's neck like two hollow daggers, and quickly sucked on it. The draconian's body that was brimming with vigor immediately shriveled, and even the scales over its body turned dull. The wizard power consumed in the battle against the draconian scout was immediately replenished. Instead, there was more draconian life force that could not be digested at once, turning into blood crystals that were stored in Mary's abdomen. "We Inerta, who are you? Abraham Gustuso, did you kill him?" A weird draconic bellow echoed from the sidelines. A strange roar in the draconic language rang out from the side. The other two dragonborn scouts sensed that something was amiss and saw the scene in front of them as soon as they returned. Mary looked up from the draconid's withered body, her blood-stained face glinting with a dangerous and greedy glint in her crimson eyes. The sharp vampiric fangs protruding from her lips were also dripping viscous blood. Powerful, pure, delicious, that was Mary's evaluation of the draconian blood. But what attracted Mary the most was the feeling of fullness that the draconian blood gave her. It had been a long time since she enjoyed such a feeling. Chapter 528. At the same time, Mary was not the only one fighting. Both sides had the same goal, so the chances of them clashing were much higher. Moreover, as invaders, they had to clear all obstacles in their way. Hence, in the dark underground tunnel, 4 to 5 battles broke out at the same time. Of course, without exception, the sorcerers won all of them. After all, the strength of both sides was clear for all to see. Although the Draconians had Tier 1 strength, that was only an innate ability derived from their incomparably powerful bodies and powerful bloodlines. Hence, they were more inclined to fight based on the instincts of beasts. In this aspect, the sorcerers were stronger than them. Almost 80% of the origins of sorcerers were frail and timid humans. After experiencing the torment of life and death and the terrifying process of being an apprentice, they became fearsome sorcerers that stood proudly in the world. Compared to the Draconians who were born with abilities, the sorcerers won everything they had, or rather, snatched it. From an apprentice to a sorcerer, there were only a few who could smoothly progress from an apprentice to a sorcerer. Most of them stepped on the corpses of their companions to reach the pinnacle of their lives, and there were also plots and schemes that were used as seasonings. Hence, almost every sorcerer had a trump card and a trump card that outsiders did not know about. They would not reveal it unless it was a matter of life and death. Through this method of nurturing sorcerers, if they encountered a group of Draconians who relied on their innate talents and bodies to survive, the sorcerers would have a higher chance of winning in a situation where they were of equal strength. Not to mention, there was also the factor of equipment. If Mary's blood bow did not have the piercing effect, even if she was faster, she would not have been able to kill a Draconian scout so easily. Apart from Mary, Poison Woman Ender, Mechanical Sorcerer Sabrina, and Berserk Witch Sophia also had their gains. As for the worm Lich Bliss, it was a pity that his scorpions could not do anything to a 30-ton giant covered in sturdy scales. Hence, after a fruitless attempt, he could only regretfully give up on the blood prey and turn to the goblin warriors. As for Grim and Alice, they did not encounter any enemies at all. It was as if they were just taking a stroll on the street, strolling to the core area of the underground. At this point, it became difficult for them to move an inch. Be it the goblins' important facilities or the dragoman's plain hall, they were all under strict protection. It was almost impossible to find an unguarded path with Alice's talent and instinct. Looking at the 3 paths that extended silently in front of her, Alice still looked calm even though she was in the enemy's lair. 3 roads lead to 3 different directions. Which one do you choose? Alice suddenly turned to Grim and asked. You should at least give me some information. Grim spread his hands. I don't have your power of foresight. The path on the left leads to Princess Vanessa's hiding place. The destiny feedback is only moderately dangerous. The one in the middle leads to the spatial furnace, which is also the place where Gaz Ruvi conducts the ritual of immortality. The feedback of fate is extremely dangerous. The one on the right leads to the dimensional hall. There's a dimensional door tightly guarded by the Draconians. Fate feedback, extremely dangerous? No, there's no chance of survival. We might encounter the terrifying Tier 3 Draconians there. Bingo, you got it right. Let's go. A cheerful smile appeared on Alice's face as she skipped and led Grim to the path in the middle. She did not know why, but ever since she left the Magus world, the huge shadow that had been weighing down on Alice's heart had silently disappeared. She no longer had the terrifying feeling that she was being watched at every moment and every move she made. Even though she knew this feeling was absurd, and that it might just be an illusion, as the person involved, she could not shake off this feeling. She had given herself to fate, but fate did not belong to her alone. Be it the top-notch beings at the peak of the plane or the former witches of destiny, they all had a subtle and mystical connection between them. Every time the power of destiny in the Magus world pulsed, it would affect their hearts and minds. No matter what they did in the River of Destiny, they would not be able to completely bypass another controller of the law of destiny. Alice was still too weak now, and did not deserve the title of controller of the law of destiny. However, this did not stop her from using the rhythm of the law of destiny to understand and investigate the abnormal actions of the other controllers of destiny. If destiny was a card table, Alice only had the right to listen and watch, but she did not have the capital or ability to play. Thus, she needed time and space to grow. As a destiny witch, Alice's favorite thing to do was to collect the power of destiny. Her daily life in the wizard's pagoda was too slow for her to collect the power of destiny. She could only gather a large amount of destiny in a short period of time if she constantly immersed herself in the great changes of destiny. Furthermore, this was not the Magus world, and she did not have to worry about the spying of the other controllers of destiny. By following Grim, she would always be able to come into contact with the controllers of destiny who could deeply influence the situation in the Goblin Plane. Be it the old goblin Gaz Ruvi, Princess Vanessa, or Tigula, they had all been deeply involved in the vortex of the Goblin Plane. In this intense clash of destinies, a wizard like her who trained in prophetic abilities could deeply sense the rhythm of destiny hidden behind every battle and every plot. Thus, in order to understand the power of destiny more fully, Alice even took the initiative to participate. She used the power of destiny she had accumulated to exert a slight but subtle influence on the general situation of the plane, changing or fine-tuning the direction and process of the development of the plane. In this process, she could not only gain a large amount of destiny power, but also understand the rules and control of the law of destiny. In the wizard world, the power of the law of destiny was too vast and obscure. With her weak power, it was inevitable that she would be crushed to death if she were to enter it. But in the Goblin Plane, most of the backlash of destiny would be shared by the so-called controllers of destiny through the subtle use of the power of others to fight back. Alice, on the other hand, could wander around and escape unscathed with Grimm's protection. This undoubtedly had indescribably huge benefits for Alice's growth. In fact, Alice could see this very clearly and thoroughly. Behind today's conflict was a great opportunity and danger for the Gnome Plane. If the Goblin Plane could successfully digest the invading wizards and Draconians as gifts, the Goblin Plane would have the chance to grow from a small-sized plane to a medium-sized one in 100 as the goblins' strength grew. But if the goblins failed, the Goblin Plane would become the backyard of the Magi and Dragonmen, becoming a plane of resources that they could plunder as they pleased. Therefore, every sip and every peck was dictated by one's fate and luck. The huge crisis in the Goblin Plain seemed to have been caused by the old goblin Gaz Ruvy's selfishness and recklessness. However, it was still the illusory energy of destiny that was playing a leading role and adding fuel to the flames behind this scheme. The appearance of magic energy, the appearance of the spatial furnace, and even the conflict between the old goblin and the goblin royal family. Traces of destiny could be faintly seen. But even if a regular person saw the general situation of destiny, they would only helplessly throw themselves into it after sighing. This was their world, and this was their life. They could not sit back and watch as their loved ones were dragged along by destiny, so choosing to sink into oblivion was their only outcome. Only an outsider like Alice could ride the waves of the river of fate in a detached and devoted manner, changing the course of the river of fate without any scruples. Just like the 3 paths that Alice had pointed out to Grimm, choosing a different path meant that the Goblin Plain's fate would be pushed to a different path. Choosing to rescue Princess Vanessa was undoubtedly choosing to support the conservative forces of the Goblin Plain, allowing them to retain a portion of their strength in this torrent of destiny. Even if the old goblin Gaz Ruvy's ritual was successful, the Goblin Plain would have 2 factions coexisting. But Grimm did not have any relations with the Goblin royal family, so there was no need for him to do anything for them. Choosing to attack the Plain Hall would undoubtedly cause a direct conflict between the Magi and Dragonmen that could not be resolved. If that happened, the only beneficiary would be the old goblin Gaz Ruvy. Not only would he have the highest chance of extending his life, but he could also take the opportunity to devour the Magi and Dragonmen, allowing him to become a true Dimensions child. But the probability of this happening was almost zero. Unless Grimm was out of his mind, he would not be so selfless as to sacrifice himself to the greedy Goblin Plain. Therefore, after much consideration, the only thing that suited the Magi the most was to fight the temporary Dimensions child, Gaz Ruvy. As long as Grimm and his group could defeat Gaz Ruvy and successfully repel the Dragonmen army, they would be able to gain control of the Goblin Plain through this battle alone. One had to give as much as they wanted to gain. There was no such thing as easy victory in this world. Even with Alice's help, Grimm had chosen the most correct path, but what awaited him at the end of the path was still a cruel and bloody battle with a slim chance of survival. Therefore, when Grimm held Alice's hand and walked on the path together, he had already made up his mind to fight to the death. Even if there was an iron wall waiting for him at the end of the path, he would use his life and flesh to smash a path through it. Chapter 529. Ritual Hall. Even though there was a bloody battle outside, it was still a busy and lively scene inside. Many gnome researchers in white lab coats ran in and out of the lab, instructing the gnome technicians to inspect the metal pipes and control hubs that extended for a few kilometers. If the Steel City was successfully activated in the future, these 3-meter diameter metal pipes would become the blood vessels of majesty, and the huge spatial furnace would become its heart. As for the old goblin Gaz Lu, he would be resurrected in the body of the Titan Majesty and become the true master of this behemoth. Yes, this was the old goblin Gaz Lu's real plan. Whether it was the eternal ritual or the invasion of the wizards and dragonoids, they were all part of Gaz Lu's Titan plan. After using so many methods, Gaz Lu finally gathered all the personnel and resources he needed inside the Steel City. Although the wizards and dragonoids were still moving freely and not under his control, as long as they were here, everything was enough. The vastness of the City of Steel was obvious to all. To activate such a huge steel city into a magical life, the amount of life force and souls needed was simply beyond everyone's imagination. That was why Gaz Lu designed to bring in all the elite combat forces of the Goblin Plain. At that time, not only would the 120,000 goblins living in the Steel City become sacrifices, but its private army, royal army, wizards, and dragonoids would also become nourishment for the resurrection of the demon god Titan. And it, the smartest goblin in the world, would use this surging life force to fuse with the steel city of the past and become the immortal Grade 4 demon god Titan. At that time, the Goblin Plane would also become the stepping stone for its rise, allowing it to become the new generation of demon god that dominated the plane world. And it would also add a new species to the multiverse, a magical life form. But before that, it first needed a huge amount of life force to fuse itself with the Steel City. In the ritual hall, Gazlu's aged body lay flat on a metal operating table, and his skull had already bloomed like a flower petal. As for the brain inside, it was carefully taken out by his loyal goblin subordinates and placed in a huge glass jar with a diameter of 10 meters and a height of 50 meters. The glass jar was filled with a light green nutrient solution, and Gazruvi's brain, which was only the size of a human's fist, swam like a tadpole as soon as it was placed inside. More than a dozen tentacles floated under the trembling brain, and it was their swaying that gave the gray brain the basic ability to move. As the battle progressed, the Dragonoid scouts that were killed were sent into the ritual hall one by one, and their corpses were thrown into a few small corpse-dissolving pools on the side. Their bodies, their souls, everything about them would melt into a pure life solution and be poured into the glass jar, becoming nourishment for Gazruvi's brain to continue to grow and grow. So after an hour of the battle, Gazlu's brain had already grown into a brain worm with a diameter of 3 meters and began to happily swim in the nutrient solution. The growth and development of the brain also allowed the goblins, who had always been known as magical insulators, to obtain a strange mental ability. Gazlu even had the ability to communicate with the goblin's subordinates outside without the help of those technological instruments. Moreover, as his brain continued to expand and strengthen, this mental ability was continuously strengthened, and it gradually gave rise to some mental sorcery that was similar to it. Telepathy, psychic stab, psychic lash, psychic blast, mind control, hypnosis, psychic illusion. God had pity on him. One after another, spiritual spells that he had never heard of or come into contact with appeared continuously. This also made Gazlu, who had never experienced extraordinary power, indescribably excited. The huge brain worm kept swimming in the glass jar, and then repeatedly activated these strange spells over and over again. Generally speaking, it could skillfully cast and use those shallow spiritual abilities almost as soon as it learned them. However, some of the slightly more complicated spiritual abilities, such as mind control and psychic blast, it could not master them even after repeatedly casting them many times. After all, these things were not obtained through hard learning and research, but the continuous growth of the brain's mental strength. When it was strengthened to a certain extent, it seemed to be able to hear and see some mysterious knowledge fragments from the outside world. Most of the time, these spiritual abilities were natural abilities that came with strong mental strength to a certain extent, and could be mastered almost without learning. And Gazlu's goblin body undoubtedly had too low a source of mental strength, so it was difficult for him to master many natural abilities. But just as Gazlu was having fun, the battle outside had developed to the point of being in dire straits. The old goblin, brainworm Gazlu's defensive line at the periphery could no longer withstand the attacks of the Magi and Dragonoids. Many key passes were lost, and large numbers of goblin private armies and mercenaries were slaughtered. But brainworm Gazlu did not care about this, and instead used telepathy to give the cruelest order to kill his subordinate. And so, when Grim and Alice stepped on the path to the spatial furnace, a bloody massacre happened in the steel capital thousands of feet above. As a goblin city, the steel capital had many gardens and plazas. At this moment, these public areas were occupied by a large number of goblin slaves. They were all tied up with ropes and knelt on the ground, and the surrounding streets were blocked by goblin chariots. Goblin mercenaries with loaded guns stood high above the surrounding goblin buildings, their pitch-black muzzles aimed at the goblin slaves in the field. Following the order, the pitch-black muzzles spat out foot-long flames, and a storm of metal bullets fell on the people like raindrops. The goblin slaves cried and wailed at the top of their lungs, but it was to no avail. Under the combined attack of the goblin chariots and goblin mercenaries, the goblins in the plazas were killed on the spot. Their bright red blood flowed happily from their sieve-like bodies, converging into streams on the metal floor, and then into a huge wave of blood through the sewer system, rushing straight into the core of the underground system. In the ritual hall, as a huge amount of blood gathered, the blood jars were filled one after another. The glass jar in which brainworm Gazruvi was in became scarlet, and the thick blood gradually engulfed its body. Although it was difficult to see what was happening in the jar from the outside, through the rolling and shaking of the wave of blood, it was still possible to see that there seemed to be a huge creature constantly struggling in pain inside. From time to time, one or two terrifying tentacles as thick as a meter would press against the transparent glass jar, wriggling there, and the bowl-sized suction cups on them could be clearly seen. As if sensing the approaching danger, Gazruvi's evolution process had clearly accelerated, and the number of goblins' blood sacrificed above the city quickly reached its peak. There were more than 120,000 residents of the Steel Capital, and with the civilians that Gazruvi's private army had captured from nearby, the number of goblins' blood sacrificed had reached a record of 150,000. Such a huge amount of vitality was channeled into the ground along with the blood, becoming the catalyst for Gazruvi's fusion with the Steel Capital, and also causing the entire underground space to become evil and strange. Gazruvi's mental strength continued to grow, and it had already penetrated through the glass jar, beginning to permeate in all directions. Metal components, alchemy machinery, control platforms, combat magic machinery, magical weapons. As long as it was within the range of Gazruvi's mental strength, it slowly began to have a trace of mental feedback. Wherever Gazruvi's mental strength extended, it would be covered with a layer of white light, and with Gazruvi's mental strength, it began to distort and deform on a large scale. It only took a quarter of an hour for Gazruvi to animate the ritual hall into a part of his body. And with the crazy influx of vitality, his consciousness began to extend along the omnipresent energy pipes and control system to other areas of the underground space. Soon, the entire underground space had become a part of his body. But compared to assimilating mindless metal machinery and alchemy machinery, Gazruvi's assimilation of the spatial furnace was extremely difficult. The surging and shaking violent magical energy in the spatial furnace was like hot magma, and every touch would cause him so much pain that he wanted to die. In the past, Gazruvi would definitely leave the spatial furnace for last, and do his best to expand his consciousness domain in the Steel Capital. Unfortunately, time was too tight for him. In his mental perception, the planar gate in the planar hall began to shake again, and it seemed that the draconian plane had made a new move. If the enemy's reinforcements arrived, it would have an unpredictable impact on Gazruvi's resurrection plan. So Gazruvi had used his power to cut off all the energy pipes leading to the planar hall. But the draconians seemed to have another energy source, and they were able to support the operation of the planar gate with their own strength. Left with no choice, Gazruvi could only mobilize a strengthened goblin magic machinery group from the periphery, and let them take a shortcut to the planar hall to stop the draconians' subsequent reinforcements from teleporting. Apart from the draconians, Gazruvi also found more than a dozen foreign invaders in his body. Among them, the terrifying fire wizard that he feared the most had actually sneaked very close to the spatial furnace with a female wizard without him noticing. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.